In the shadows of New York, a man rose from the streets to become underboss of the most feared crime family. 19 murders behind him, a secret on his tongue, and a betrayal that would shatter the mafia forever. This is the story of Sammy the Bull Gravano and the fall of John Gotti. The story begins not in the marble halls of power or inside the smoky backrooms of Manhattan, but in a Brooklyn neighborhood where the scent of fresh bread and tomato sauce drifted through the streets, where kids played stickball under the watchful eyes of grandmothers on stoops, and where whispers of Cosa Nostra carried almost as much weight as the church bells on Sunday morning. Bensonhurst. The name itself carried a kind of mythology in mid-20th century New York. To outsiders, it was just another Italian-American neighborhood, insular and stubbornly resistant to change. But for those who grew up inside its tight-knit streets, it was something else entirely. A place where community pride was fierce, where family bonds were everything, and where the shadows cast by the mafia stretched longer than the lampposts at night. It was here, on March 12, 1945, that Salvatore Gravano entered the world. To the neighborhood, he would soon simply be Sammy. Later, they would call him the Bull, and eventually, his name would become infamous across America. But in those first years, he was just another kid in a crowded Italian-American home, the son of hard-working immigrants who believed, perhaps naively, that honest labor and devotion to family could insulate them from the temptations of the street. His father, Jerry, had come from Sicily and made a living as a painter until illness forced him out of the trade. His mother, Kay, stitched dresses with a precision and patience that would keep the family afloat. They were ordinary people in an extraordinary neighborhood, a place where ordinary rules didn't always apply. On Sundays, Jerry would take Sammy to Mass. They would walk past a corner bar where men stood in pressed suits, their pinky rings catching the morning light. Money changed hands over sidewalk dice games, and uniformed police officers leaned casually against their patrol car, laughing with the men everyone else avoided. Sammy once asked his father about them. Who were those men? Jerry's reply was quiet, almost reverent. They're bad people, but there are bad people. It was a line that would echo in Sammy's mind for the rest of his life. From the start, he struggled in school. Teachers mistook his dyslexia for stupidity, and humiliation followed him from classroom to classroom. When he couldn't keep up with spelling tests, he relied on his fists to reclaim his dignity. By the time most kids were learning long division, Sammy had already learned that violence could silence laughter faster than any clever comeback. That reputation caught the attention of the older men who lingered outside the bars. When he fought two older boys to reclaim a stolen bicycle, refusing to give up even as tears and blood mixed on his face, one of the wise guys watching gave him a nickname. "He's like a little bull," the man said. The name stuck. Sammy the Bull was born, not out of ceremony or blood oath, but from a child's stubborn refusal to back down. By his teenage years, the streets had become his real classroom. He joined the Rampers, a neighborhood gang that blurred the line between juvenile mischief and organized crime. They weren't yet part of the mafia, but the mafia was watching. In Bensonhurst, they always were. The Rampers carried themselves with a reckless confidence. They stole cars, burglarized businesses, and brawled with rival gangs. To them, it was a game of survival and respect. To the older mobsters, it was a farm system, a place where the next generation of soldiers cut their teeth. Sammy thrived in that environment. He was quick with his fists, quicker with his temper, and unafraid of cops who tried to keep order. When a police officer once barked at him to clear the street, Sammy answered with his knuckles. Arrests followed, but so did lessons. Lawyers connected to the mob smoothed things over in court. Cases disappeared. Fines replaced jail time. And slowly, Gravano began to understand the unspoken truth of his neighborhood. In Bensonhurst, connections mattered more than innocence. But beneath the bravado was something darker. A hunger for belonging, for recognition, for respect. School had branded him a failure. The Rampers made him feel like somebody. And the mobsters at the corner bar, the ones his father warned him about, they represented the ultimate validation. As the 1960s rolled in, the mafia's presence in New York was undeniable. The 5 families carved the city like a map of influence, each borough a chessboard of rackets, unions, and blood feuds. The Rampers found themselves swept into the turbulence of mob wars between the Prophesy and Gallo factions. Sammy was still just a kid, but gunfire in bars and bodies on sidewalks were no longer distant headlines. They were part of his daily reality. One night, what started as a barroom beef escalated into a shootout that could have come straight from a gangster film. Bullets tore through glass and wood, patrons screamed, and when the smoke cleared, a man lay riddled with wounds yet somehow alive. For Sammy and his friends, it was a baptism by fire. The Mafia intervened to keep the Rampers from being slaughtered in retaliation, a sign that these kids were more valuable alive than dead. It was Gravano's first brush with the delicate politics of Cosa Nostra, though he wouldn't realize its significance until much later. Through it all, Sammy kept moving forward, reckless, violent, but oddly disciplined in his own way. His path wasn't yet inevitable, but the streets were narrowing around him. Every fight, every arrest, every nod of approval from the men in suits pulled him closer to a world where loyalty meant silence, respect was measured in blood, and survival often required betrayal. And in Bensonhurst, where everyone knew everyone else, the boy called Sammy the Bull was already becoming a man who couldn't be ignored. Bensonhurst in the 1940s and 50s was a world unto itself. If you were born there, you grew up surrounded by the same faces, the same churches, the same corner stores. Outsiders didn't just feel unwelcome. They were noticed, discussed, and quietly warned off. It was a place where old-world Sicily still lingered in the cadence of speech and the smell of cooking, but where American ambition simmered beneath the surface. For boys like Sammy Gravano, that mix created both opportunity and danger. Sammy was the youngest child of his family. 2 siblings had died before he was born, and 2 older sisters survived him, leaving him the only son, a role that carried unspoken expectations in an Italian household. His mother, Kay, poured herself into work and into holding the family together. His father, Jerry, tried to live by example, preaching honesty and hard work even as illness stripped him of his trade. They wanted Sammy to grow up straight, to carry himself with dignity, and to stay far away from the men who ruled the neighborhood through fear and respect. But the pull of the streets was relentless. Every block had its hangouts. The candy stores where boys congregated after school. The luncheonettes where gangs carved out territory. The bars where the older wise guys kept a casual but constant watch. Kids looked up to them, even when their fathers warned them not to. They had money, cars, flashy jewelry. They didn't seem to answer to anyone. And in a community that still remembered discrimination from Irish cops and city officials, those men represented power that Italians could claim as their own. Sammy's difficulties in school pushed him closer to that world. Dyslexia was a word almost no one knew in Bensonhurst at the time. To teachers, he was simply slow, maybe even retarded. The humiliation cut deep. While other children sounded out long words, he was asked to spell cat. When he got it wrong, laughter followed. And so he did what felt natural, he fought. The first time he bloodied another boy's nose for mocking him, the laughter stopped. The lesson was simple and brutal. Fists could command the respect that books never would. That shift in mindset was like striking a match in dry brush. Sammy became known as the kid who wouldn't take ridicule, the one who would fight anyone, anywhere. By 9 or 10 years old, he was already gaining a reputation in his corner of Brooklyn. The wise guys noticed. The nickname came during that bicycle fight, when Sammy refused to let 2 older kids steal what his parents had saved so hard to give him. The bar crowd, amused by his determination, dubbed him the Little Bull. In Bensonhurst, names had weight. Once a nickname stuck, it became part of your identity. From that day forward, Salvatore Gravano would never again simply be Salvatore or Sal. He was Sammy the Bull, a name that carried both respect and expectation. By his teenage years, Sammy gravitated to the Rampers, a gang that ruled the local streets with fists, knives, and eventually guns. They weren't the Mafia, not yet, but they played in the Mafia's shadow. Their rules were simple. Loyalty above all, strength respected, weakness despised. The Rampers fought with other gangs, Italian, Irish, Puerto Rican, Black, anyone who crossed into their territory. Turf wars played out in alleys, in bars, and sometimes in broad daylight. To outsiders, it was senseless violence. To Sammy and his friends, it was survival and education in the language of the streets. The Rampers specialized in robberies, businesses, warehouses, and cars. They prided themselves on never hitting private homes. That, they said, was beneath them, dishonorable even. They justified their crimes with the belief that businesses had insurance, that they weren't really hurting anyone who couldn't afford it. But beneath that thin veil of rationalization was the thrill of power, the rush of easy money, and the growing sense that they were untouchable. The police tried, but the Rampers had protection. Lawyers connected to the Mafia appeared when arrests happened. Charges shrank. Cases evaporated. It wasn't just luck. It was a system one Sammy was beginning to glimpse. The Mafia watched the Rampers not to destroy them, but to cultivate them. One incident drove that lesson home. A clash between the Rampers and men connected to the Gallo brothers erupted in a barroom. Guns came out. Bullets flew. Glass shattered and customers screamed as chaos reigned. By the end, one man had been shot repeatedly but somehow lived. Word spread quickly, the Gallos wanted revenge. For a teenage gang, that could have meant certain death. But then came whispers of sit-downs, Mafia-style negotiations. The Prophesy family, the Gambinos, powerful names from the underworld convened to decide the fate of kids barely old enough to vote. In the end, the Rampers were spared. They were good neighborhood kids. The families decided, not enemies to be slaughtered. For Sammy, the message was clear. The mob was watching, and their word was law. As the 1960s progressed, Sammy's life oscillated between the ordinary and the criminal. At home, he was still the respectful son who shoveled snow, carried groceries, and treated neighbors kindly. On the streets, he was the bull, feared and respected, earning his stripes with every fight and every job. That duality, family man and criminal, would become a defining theme of his life. But even as he embraced the street, his father tried to steer him away. Jerry believed in hard work. He dreamed of bringing his son into the family's small dress business, teaching him an honest trade. He urged Sammy to build something real, something lasting. But for a boy who had tasted the adrenaline of street fights and the intoxicating approval of men in sharp suits, sewing machines and ledgers felt like prison bars. The more his father pushed, the more Sammy drifted. And the deeper he went into the Rampers, the more he was pulled toward the inevitable orbit of Cosa Nostra. It was only a matter of time. By his mid-teens, Sammy had already tasted the thrill of lawlessness and the sting of the law itself. Arrests became a rite of passage, not a deterrent. To him, the cops weren't guardians of order but enemies. Another gang with badges, often crueler than the criminals they pursued. One of his earliest arrests came after a confrontation with a cop known in the neighborhood for throwing his weight around. The officer barked at Sammy and his friends to clear the street. Most of the kids scattered. Sammy lingered. When the cop came closer, nightstick in hand, Sammy swung first. The officer went down hard, and Sammy, barely more than a boy, stood over him with defiance burning in his eyes. The beating he got in return was brutal. At the station house, cops worked him over until his face was swollen and bloodied. But Sammy refused to give names. He wouldn't rat. Even then, he understood the unspoken code. Silence was survival. When the case reached court, it seemed inevitable he'd do time. But connections changed everything. A lawyer with underworld ties pulled strings, postponed hearings until the right prosecutor was in place, and finally cut a deal that reduced the charge to a misdemeanor and a fine. Sammy walked free, bruised but enlightened. Justice, he realized, wasn't blind. It was for sale. That lesson sank deep. The Rampers, meanwhile, were growing more ambitious. Burglaries turned into stick-ups. Car theft became car trafficking. They weren't just stealing for themselves anymore. They were supplying pipelines that moved vehicles overseas, feeding a criminal economy far larger than they'd imagined. By accident or instinct, they were learning the infrastructure of organized crime. Sammy proved himself reliable, fearless, and, perhaps most importantly, loyal. He wasn't the biggest or the smartest, but he had a presence that others noticed. When a job needed muscle, he was there. When a fight broke out, he didn't back down. And when trust mattered, he kept his mouth shut. That loyalty was tested the night he and a fellow ramper named Joe V stole a car and suddenly found themselves in a deadly chase. Another vehicle pulled up alongside, a man leaning out with a rifle, screaming that Sammy had stolen his ride. Bullets tore through the stolen car. Joe V took one in the gut. Sammy caught one in the head, a graze that nearly killed him. Bleeding, dizzy, he still managed to crash through traffic, evade pursuit, and drag Joe to safety. They were both half dead, hiding in an alley while police sirens wailed in the distance. Joe survived after losing his spleen. Sammy, too, lived scarred but hardened. To the rampers, he was now more than a tough kid. He was a survivor. To Sammy himself, the near-death experience only confirmed what he already believed. Fate had chosen him for this life. Back in Bensonhurst, his parents saw the changes with quiet despair. Jerry urged him again to leave the streets, to take up a trade, to find honest work. Sammy tried briefly. He joined his father in the dress business, helped with deliveries, even flirted with the idea of construction. But the pull of the rampers was too strong. Honest work couldn't compete with the rush of easy money, the camaraderie of the gang, or the nods of approval from men in silk suits who called him by name. There were moments when another life seemed possible. A girl named Lorraine, his steady girlfriend from junior high, dreamed of marrying him, settling down, building a family. For a while, Sammy considered it. He loved her, respected her family, even imagined a quieter path with her. But each time, the streets called him back. He wasn't built, he told himself, for the ordinary life. Then came another woman, Louise Grimaldi. Blonde, striking, almost ethereal compared to the rough girls of the neighborhood. She was innocent, untouched by the streets, and Sammy was captivated. She would later become his wife, but in those early days she represented something even more intoxicating. The idea that he could live two lives at once. The loyal family man and the rising gangster. That duality, the son who carried groceries for old neighbors while also plotting burglaries by night, became the hallmark of Gravano's identity. To his parents, he was still respectful. To his friends, he was a leader. To the wise guys, he was promising. And to himself, he was becoming something larger than all of them. A man who could bend both worlds to his will. The rampers swore loyalty to each other with a teenage bravado that felt like destiny. Forever. Fuck the world. Fuck everybody else. They told themselves. But even among them, cracks were forming. Some drifted toward legitimate jobs. Others chased bigger rackets and found themselves pulled into the orbit of the mafia families that dominated New York. For Sammy, it wasn't a question of if. It was when. By the mid-1960s, the mafia was everywhere in Bensonhurst. The Prophesy family, later renamed the Colombo family, held sway. The Gambinos had power too, especially with their stronghold in Brooklyn. Sit-downs, mob wars, and assassinations rippled through the city, and even kids like Sammy could feel the tremors. The rampers, for all their bravado, were still small time. To rise higher, to control unions, nightclubs, or real money rackets, you needed permission. You needed backing. You needed to be connected. Sammy's trajectory was set. His toughness, his loyalty, his instincts, they were all currency the mafia valued. And the mafia was watching. By 1964, the Vietnam War was heating up, and like so many young men from working-class neighborhoods, Sammy found himself drafted. The rampers swore he'd find a way out, that no judge or recruiter could force him into the service. But fate, the same fate that had put bullets through his head and still left him standing, had other plans. At the induction center, Sammy thought it was all just routine. You took the physical, maybe bought yourself a few months, maybe found a doctor to scribble a medical excuse. But this time was different. One moment he was in line for a checkup, the next he was being told he was shipping out that very day. No time to say goodbye, no last night in Bensonhurst. Just the army, ready or not. For a boy who had grown up in a world where respect was earned with fists and silence, the military was a strange mix of structure and opportunity. Sammy was in top physical shape, and basic training didn't break him the way it did others. Push-ups, obstacle courses, long marches. They were nothing compared to the bruises and beatings he'd endured in Brooklyn. He rose quickly in his unit, impressing sergeants who saw in him a soldier who never backed down. The army introduced him to discipline, but it also sharpened a trait that would define him forever: a hatred for betrayal. When he discovered that some of the sergeants were secretly betting on the boxing matches he fought in, it enraged him. Not the gambling itself, he had no problem with that. It was the dishonesty, the manipulation behind his back. That sense of betrayal, even in small things, lit a fire in him. Years later, it would be the same instinct that soured him on John Gotti. There were fights in the army too, not gang fights, but racial ones. Sammy had grown up throwing around slurs on the streets without much thought. But the Deep South was another matter. He found himself in the middle of real racial tensions, watching rednecks sneer at black soldiers and calling him a New York greaseball. When one of them pushed too far, Sammy swung with a mess spoon and touched off a kitchen brawl that nearly landed him in the stockade. But somehow, just as in Bensonhurst, he came out not punished but respected. The black sergeant in charge chewed him out, then winked. Sammy wasn't fighting for justice. He was fighting because disrespect wasn't tolerated. Yet once again, the result was the same. Loyalty earned, betrayal despised, and respect claimed the hard way. When he wasn't fighting, Sammy was hustling. He started a craps game on base, the same way he had seen the corner guys back home run dice games on sidewalks. Soon enough, half the barracks were throwing their paychecks across the felt. And when soldiers ran out of cash, Sammy became their banker, slipping into loan sharking without even realizing it. By the time MPs came sniffing around, he already had sergeants on his payroll. For the second time in his young life, he saw the truth. Rules were just obstacles for those without connections. For those who dared, rules were meant to be bent. The army liked Sammy. They wanted him to re-enlist, even offered him sergeant stripes and his choice of posts. But by the time his 2 years were up, he knew where he belonged. Not in the military, not in Vietnam, not following orders barked by strangers. His world was back in Brooklyn, in Bensonhurst, where the rampers still prowled the streets and the mob still ran the show. When he returned home, things had changed. His parents had retired to a small house in Long Island. His old girlfriend Lorraine still wanted him to settle down, to marry, to live quietly. But Sammy, fresh out of the army, full of restless energy and new confidence, had no intention of settling. He drifted easily back into the rampers, slipping into robberies and stolen cars as if no time had passed. The army had given him discipline and confidence, but not direction. Instead of applying it to a trade or a career, he applied it to crime. He was sharper now, more calculating. He wasn't just a hot-headed kid throwing punches. He was a young man learning how to build an operation, how to run a crew, how to command respect. The divide between Sammy the son and Sammy the gangster widened further. At home, he was still the respectful boy who helped his mother, still the loyal son who listened to his father's advice. But on the streets, he was no longer just the bull in name. He was becoming one in truth, charging forward without hesitation, taking what he wanted, and leaving others to deal with the wreckage. His first years back in Bensonhurst made one thing clear: the world of corner bars and gang hangouts was no longer enough. The rampers had reached their ceiling. They could only go so far on their own. To climb higher, into unions, rackets, clubs, real money, they needed backing. They needed the Mafia. And the Mafia was ready. Back from the army, Sammy Gravano was 19 years old and restless. 2 years of military discipline hadn't tamed him. It had refined him. He had learned structure, how to bide his time, how to wait for the right moment to strike. But more importantly, he had discovered that power came from control, and control came from understanding human weakness. In the army, he had learned to run dice games and loan shark schemes. Back in Bensonhurst, those lessons translated easily to the streets. The rampers welcomed him home, and it didn't take long for Sammy to slide back into robberies and hijackings. Yet something inside him had shifted. He wasn't satisfied with smash and grab anymore. He wanted more, and more was always in the hands of the Mafia. Still, there were flickers of another life. One of the strangest turns in his early years came when a friend convinced him to enroll in a Brooklyn beauty school. It sounded like a joke at first. Sammy Gravano, the tough street kid, learning to cut hair and paint nails. But the scam was simple. Veterans benefits would pay his tuition, and unemployment checks would cover the rest. He barely needed to show up. The owner only cared about the government's money. Sammy played along, sitting in classrooms surrounded by hundreds of young women. For a street kid who had spent most of his life fighting and hustling, it was surreal. The beauty school was less about cutting hair than about temptation. Affairs, whispered conversations, stolen moments behind closed doors. Sammy soaked it up. But beneath the comedy of a mob-tough kid botching haircuts and turning women's hair sky blue, something more serious was happening. He realized that people, especially women, talked freely in beauty parlors. They let their guard down. They revealed things they wouldn't confess anywhere else. Secrets spilled in casual chatter. And Sammy learned to listen. That skill, hearing what others didn't mean to reveal, would serve him long after the beauty school days were gone. Still, the streets pulled harder. Louise Grimaldi, the blonde beauty who had stolen his heart, was waiting. She was young, pure in a way Lorraine hadn't been, untouched by the grime of the neighborhood. To Sammy, she seemed like a chance at legitimacy, at respectability. Yet at the same time, his nights were still spent with the rampers, still planning robberies, still ducking cops, still brushing up against the mafia's reach. The rampers' bravado began colliding with reality. They were fearless, yes, but they were also reckless. Shootouts with rivals, brushes with death, betrayals whispered in alleys. It all reminded them that without backing, they were vulnerable. Sammy could feel it too. The rampers were strong, but they weren't a family. Not like the real families, the Gambinos, the Colombos, the Genovese, who ran New York with rules, tradition, and an iron hand. Then came the close calls that hardened his path. One robbery went sideways, and Sammy was nearly killed when a bullet tore a chunk out of his skull. Another time, a stolen car chase ended with blood soaking the seats, his friend Joe V nearly dead, and Sammy dragging him through the dark streets like a soldier carrying a wounded brother. Each time, Sammy survived. Each time, he came back harder. By now, he had a reputation in Bensonhurst that stretched beyond the rampers. He was tough, loyal, and unafraid. The wise guys at the corner bars, the ones his father once warned him about, now nodded with recognition when they saw him. Sammy the Bull. Not just a nickname anymore, but a brand. At home, Jerry Gravano tried one last time to steer his son straight. He offered him work in the dress factory, connections to jobs in construction, a chance at an honest life. But for Sammy, the choice had already been made. Honest sweat wasn't going to buy him respect, wasn't going to make people fear him, wasn't going to give him the power he craved. Respect, real respect, in Bensonhurst came from one place, the Mafia. The rampers had reached their ceiling. They could only go so far on their own. To climb higher, to seize real money, to open clubs, to run rackets, to step into the world of power instead of nipping at its edges, they needed to be connected. And Sammy Gravano was already on the Mafia's radar. In the shadows of Bensonhurst, men like Joe Colombo, Aniello Delacroce, and Paul Castellano were shaping the future of New York's underworld. Their soldiers watched the streets for talent, for young men who showed toughness, loyalty, and ambition. Gravano, the dyslexic boy once mocked in classrooms, had become a man whose name was whispered with a mix of fear and admiration. Installment 1 closes here, on the edge of transformation. Sammy the Bull Gravano was no longer just the tough kid from Bensonhurst. He was a soldier in waiting, a gangster in the making, a man standing at the doorway of Cosa Nostra. His childhood battles, his army years, his hustles and heartbreaks. All of it had been preparation. The next chapter of his life would pull him into the Mafia's inner circle, where violence was currency, loyalty was law, and betrayal was inevitable. When Sammy Gravano came back from the army, Bensonhurst wasn't just familiar, it was destiny calling him home. The streets, the corner bars, the candy stores with their back tables and whispered deals. They all felt like an extension of his blood. For a while, he tried to balance two worlds. The woman he loved and the life he couldn't let go of. Louise Grimaldi was everything the neighborhood wasn't. Blonde, blue-eyed, untouched by the grime of street hustling. She looked like she belonged in another life. Sammy adored her, not just for her beauty, but because she represented a piece of innocence he never had. By his early 20s, they were married. Soon, they had children. To his family, Sammy was a husband and father, doting in his own way, providing for them the only way he knew how. But beneath the surface, the other life was alive and thriving. Sammy opened a small business, a bar at first, then later a discotheque. On paper, he was an entrepreneur, a neighborhood guy making something of himself. In reality, these businesses were more than legitimate fronts. They were magnets for the underworld. Loan sharking, gambling, stolen goods, they flowed through his establishments like electricity through wires. Running a bar in Bensonhurst was never just about serving drinks. It was about who drank there, who you let in, who you kept out, and who you paid to make sure your doors stayed open. Every liquor license, every delivery truck, every construction job, all of it was controlled by someone higher up. And those someones were always connected to the mafia. It didn't take long for Sammy to attract attention. At first, it came in the form of requests. A local soldier in the Gambino family would stop by, friendly enough, and mention that so-and-so had an interest in jukeboxes. Would Sammy mind switching out his machines for theirs? The cut would go to the family, of course. A small thing. A favor. Later, it might be vending machines or garbage collection, or a hint that protection was available if ever he needed it. These weren't requests you could refuse. But for Sammy, they weren't burdens either. They were opportunities. The mafia wasn't just knocking on his door. It was inviting him in. Sammy still carried himself as the respectful son. The husband who adored Louise, the father who doted on his children. But the double life was deepening. To the wise guys, he was no longer just a tough street kid. He was proving he could handle business, that he could navigate money, respect, and loyalty all at once. One of his first serious connections came through Aniello Delacroce, underboss of the Gambino family. Delacroce was a man of shadows, the opposite of John Gotti's flamboyance. He was old school, Sicilian in manner, and deeply respected. Sammy admired him almost instantly. To Sammy, Delacroce represented what a mobster was supposed to be: quiet, controlled, dangerous without showboating. Through Delacroce's orbit, Sammy began to see the architecture of the mafia from the inside. Sit-downs weren't just meetings. They were diplomacy, chess games played with lives. Disputes weren't solved with fists anymore, but with hierarchy and rules. Rules as strict as any army. Cosa Nostra wasn't chaos. It was order, enforced by blood. Still, Sammy hadn't yet earned his button, hadn't been officially made. He was an associate, a friend of the family, moving closer to the inner circle but not yet inside. That line, thin as it seemed, was a chasm. Associates could make money, run rackets, even kill if ordered. But they weren't protected. They could be discarded, replaced, silenced. To be truly secure in the mafia, you had to be one of them. And Sammy wanted it more than anything. The Rampers, his old gang, had mostly scattered by now. Some drifted into legitimate work. Others landed in prison or vanished into the cracks of the underworld. Sammy was different. He wasn't content to fade. He wanted to rise, and the path upward was paved with loyalty and blood. One of his early tests came in the form of a dispute over construction work, a world the mafia controlled with iron grip. Sammy had opened a small drywall company, and soon enough, rival crews tried muscling in. Contracts weren't just about money. They were about territory, about respect. When the rivals pushed, Sammy pushed back. Hard. There were beatings, threats, even whispers of a murder contract. Through it all, Sammy handled himself with a calm brutality that caught the eye of higher-ups. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't a hothead anymore. He was controlled, precise, willing to act, but never without purpose. In those years, Gravano carved out his reputation. He wasn't the flashiest, but he was reliable. He didn't chase headlines. He avoided the spotlight. In that way, he was the opposite of John Gotti, though their paths would soon collide. For now, Sammy was proving something more important: that he could live in two worlds at once. To his wife and children, he was family first. To the mafia, he was loyalty embodied. And to himself, he was finally becoming what he had always felt destined to be. A man who mattered. A man who could command respect in a world that had once laughed at him. But the Mafia isn't a place for dual lives. Sooner or later, the two worlds collide. And for Sammy the Bull Gravano, that collision was coming fast. If there was one industry that defined the Mafia's grip on New York, it was construction. The skyline itself, the office towers of Manhattan, the apartment blocks of Brooklyn, the bridges, the highways, all of it bore the fingerprints of Cosa Nostra. Concrete contracts, drywall, trucking, unions, every nail and every slab of cement could be touched by mob influence. For Sammy, construction became his bridge from the street life into the upper levels of organized crime. He started small. A drywall company with a couple of trucks, a few workers, and his own muscle to keep competitors at bay. To outsiders, he looked like a hard-working young entrepreneur, a neighborhood kid making good. But in Bensonhurst, everyone knew, no one opened a business in construction without somebody's blessing. Soon enough, rival crews came sniffing around. They weren't just looking for work. They were testing Sammy. Could they push him off jobs? Could they intimidate him into backing down? For Gravano, backing down was never an option. One confrontation escalated when a rival crew tried to muscle him off a contract. Sammy responded with fists, then with bats, then with guns. No one in his crew hesitated because they knew what was at stake. To lose face in construction wasn't just about money. It meant you didn't belong. It meant you weren't tough enough to hold territory. Word of Sammy's stand traveled quickly. In the underworld, stories mattered almost as much as facts. Men began to talk about the kid with the drywall company who wouldn't budge, who wouldn't fold even when the odds were stacked. And the Mafia listened. One of the Gambino captains summoned Sammy to a sit-down, his first real taste of the Mafia's formal world. The meeting wasn't about punishment, as Sammy had feared. It was recognition. He was told that he had handled himself like a man, like someone who understood the rules of the street. If he wanted to keep working in construction, though, he'd have to do it under their umbrella. For Sammy, it wasn't a defeat. It was an invitation. The Mafia didn't take men in overnight. They tested them, measured their loyalty, watched how they handled pressure. Sammy's reputation for violence, controlled, not reckless, set him apart. He wasn't some hot-headed street punk. He could keep his mouth shut. He could take orders. He could deliver results. But there was one more test that mattered above all others. Violence wasn't enough. Beatings weren't enough. To prove yourself worthy of becoming one of us, as the Mafia said, you had to kill. Sammy had already been in shootouts, already carried the scars of bullets. But this was different. This wasn't survival or self-defense or street beef. This was murder, sanctioned, ordered, part of the machinery of Cosa Nostra. The target was a man who had broken the rules, someone whose loyalty had been questioned. Sammy was given the task not as a punishment, but as an opportunity. If he could do this cleanly, quietly, without hesitation, it would prove once and for all that he belonged. The night of the hit, Sammy prepared like a soldier. Calm, steady, detached. When the moment came, he pulled the trigger without flinching. The man went down, and with him, the last trace of Sammy's old life as a neighborhood tough disappeared. He wasn't just Sammy the Bull anymore. He was an associate of the Gambino family. From that moment, the Mafia became his full-time reality. His construction business grew, protected and enhanced by his connections. He learned how to use unions as weapons, how a strike could shut down an entire site, how a well-placed bribe could make inspectors look the other way, how concrete and drywall contracts were carved up like slices of pie among the families. He learned that money flowed upward. Associates kicked up to soldiers, soldiers to captains, captains to bosses. But power flowed downward. Orders given in whispers, carried out in blood. At home, Louise saw only part of the man her husband was becoming. He still loved her, still doted on their children, still carried himself as a family man. But she knew enough to stay silent about the nights he didn't come home, the envelopes of cash, the sudden bursts of violence. In the Mafia world, women weren't supposed to ask questions. Sammy liked it that way. Two lives, parallel, coexisting. But even he knew it couldn't last forever. The deeper he went, the closer those worlds crept toward collision. By the early 1970s, Sammy Gravano had established himself as more than just another street kid who hung around wise guys. He was becoming indispensable. He had money-making businesses, he had crews who followed him without question, and most importantly, he had shown he could kill without hesitation. Cosa Nostra rewards loyalty, but it demands proof. Sammy had given proof. And now, the gates of the Mafia were opening wider. The Mafia doesn't just make men with bullets and ceremonies. It molds them through mentorship, through the examples set by those higher up, by the way power is displayed, and the way it is concealed. For Sammy Gravano, two men would shape his early understanding of Cosa Nostra more than any others. Aniello Delacroce and Paul Castellano. Delacroce, the Gambino underboss, was everything the movies never captured. He wasn't flamboyant, didn't strut in silk suits or bask in cameras. He was quiet, brooding, a man of shadows. He carried himself with the gravity of old-world Cosa Nostra, Sicilian to the bone, ruthless when needed but never reckless. In Delacroce, Sammy saw a reflection of the values he admired: loyalty, silence, precision. If there was such a thing as honor in the Mafia, Delacroce embodied it. Paul Castellano, on the other hand, represented something entirely different. As boss of the Gambino family after the death of Carlo Gambino, Castellano saw himself as more businessman than gangster. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island, styled himself after corporate executives, and preferred making deals with Wall Street types rather than spending nights in smoky social clubs. To many in the streets, Castellano felt distant, even arrogant. He spoke more about unions and contracts than about respect and blood. Sammy would find himself caught between these two worlds: the old-school gangster code of Delacroce and the boardroom bossing of Castellano. At first, Castellano's influence came through business. Sammy's construction company grew under the Gambino umbrella, and Castellano valued men who could earn. Drywall, trucking, unions, Sammy proved he could run them all.
Castellano noticed.
But Castellano didn't want killers. He wanted earners who kept violence quiet and money flowing. Sammy was both. That duality, earner and killer, made him stand out. Most men were one or the other. Sammy was becoming both. His reputation deepened after another killing, one whispered about in Bensonhurst for years. A man suspected of plotting against the family had to go. The order came down, and Sammy was part of the crew tasked with carrying it out. He didn't hesitate. For Sammy, it was almost mechanical by now. Plan, execute, disappear. When the body dropped, so did any lingering doubts about his future. Gravano wasn't just an associate anymore. He was a man proving himself worthy of being made. At home, life continued with a strange normalcy. Louise raised their children, built a household that looked ordinary from the outside. Sammy played the role of father, attending birthdays, giving gifts, showing affection. To neighbors, he was the family man who happened to own a construction company. To Louise, he was the husband who loved her, but carried secrets she never dared to probe. It was this balance, ruthless mobster by night, devoted father by day, that made Sammy so dangerous. Many mobsters lived only in the underworld, consumed by crime until paranoia destroyed them. Sammy had an anchor. He had something to lose. And for him, that made betrayal unthinkable. The Mafia wasn't just a business. It was the shield that protected his family, the code that gave his violent life a purpose. But the higher he rose, the more he saw the fractures inside the Gambino family. Castellano's businesslike style clashed with Delacroce's street loyalty. Some soldiers respected Castellano's wealth and his ability to make millions without firing shots. Others whispered that he was out of touch, that he didn't understand the streets anymore, that he cared more for white-collar schemes than for the men bleeding on the pavement. Sammy absorbed it all. He learned how families split, how loyalty shifted, how ambition turned allies into rivals. He watched, he listened, he waited. And in the middle of it all, he continued to build his own empire. His construction company grew stronger. His influence in Bensonhurst deepened. His reputation as a man who got things done, whether that meant negotiating contracts or pulling a trigger, spread beyond his neighborhood. By the late 1970s, Sammy Gravano was no longer just a tough kid with a gang nickname. He was a trusted associate in the Gambino family, a man whose rise seemed unstoppable. He had the respect of Delacroce, the attention of Castellano, and the fear of anyone foolish enough to cross him. And yet, the storm clouds of mafia politics were gathering. Castellano's arrogance, Delacroce's loyalty, and the ambitions of another rising star, John Gotti, would soon collide in ways that would reshape the entire mafia landscape. For now, though, Sammy was on the ascent. The boy who once struggled to spell cat in a Bensonhurst classroom had become a man whose very name carried weight. In every corner bar, in every union hall, in every whispered conversation in Brooklyn, people knew Sammy the Bull was no longer on the outside looking in. He was inside, and he was climbing. By the late 1970s, New York City was a chessboard of power. The mafia was still at the height of its influence, but the pieces were shifting. And in the Gambino family, the most powerful of the 5 families, fault lines were forming that would soon explode into blood. At the center of it all was Paul Castellano. Elevated to boss after the death of Carlo Gambino, Castellano ran the family less like a street gang and more like a corporation. His mansion on Staten Island, with its marble floors and sprawling gardens, became a symbol of his reign. He surrounded himself with businessmen, accountants, and lawyers. He dreamed not of backroom sit-downs in smoke-filled clubs, but of white-collar schemes that made millions in construction, unions, and Wall Street. To men like Sammy Gravano, Castellano was a paradox. On one hand, Castellano had power, real power, the kind that controlled billion-dollar industries. On the other, he seemed distant from the very streets that gave that power meaning. He discouraged drug dealing but winked at men who trafficked quietly. He avoided neighborhood social clubs, preferring the company of politicians and businessmen. And worst of all, to many in the ranks, he seemed to look down on them, as though his position placed him above the very men who fed the empire. Aniello Delacroce, Castellano's underboss, represented the opposite. Stationed at the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy, Delacroce lived among the soldiers. He listened to their problems, settled their disputes, handed out advice like a father figure. To the rank and file, Delacroce was one of us. He didn't have Castellano's mansion, but he had their loyalty. Sammy admired Delacroce deeply. There was something about his presence, the way he carried silence, the way his eyes spoke more than his words. Delacroce commanded respect not with arrogance, but with certainty. When Delacroce entered a room, men sat straighter. Sammy knew this was the kind of man you could follow into war. But Castellano was the boss, and in the mafia, the boss's word was law. This tension simmered through the family. Soldiers and captains began choosing sides, some leaning toward Castellano's vision of businessmen mobsters, others swearing loyalty to Delacroce's street values. And in the shadows, another figure was rising, John Gotti. If Castellano was the businessman and Delacroce the quiet statesman, Gotti was the star. Loud, brash, dressed in $1,000 suits, he relished attention. He held court in Ozone Park, surrounded by loyalists who adored his defiance. He didn't just walk through the streets. He owned them, striding with the confidence of a man who knew he was destined for more. To Sammy, Gotti was fascinating. Here was a man who defied Castellano openly, who laughed in the face of bosses who wanted quiet. Gotti represented everything Castellano wasn't: dangerous, unpredictable, flamboyant. The Gambino family was becoming a house divided, and Sammy knew he had to tread carefully. During this time, Sammy was carving out his own empire in construction. His drywall business flourished, protected by the family. He learned the art of the contract game, how unions could be pressured, how jobs could be delayed until bribes were paid, how every brick laid in New York carried a hidden tax for Cosa Nostra. He grew wealthy, powerful in his own right, but he never forgot that in the mafia, everything was borrowed power. It all came from the boss above. He also continued to prove himself with violence. Disputes that couldn't be solved with sit-downs often ended with gunfire, and Sammy never hesitated when orders came down. He was careful, calculated, never reckless. Each time, his reputation grew Gravano was a man who could be trusted with the most delicate matters. At home, the duality continued. Louise and the children lived in comfort. Sammy provided, always making sure his family wanted for nothing. Birthdays, holidays, neighborhood gatherings, he was there, smiling, the devoted husband and father. But when the phone rang in the middle of the night, when whispers came of a job or a meeting, he was gone in an instant. The balance between these worlds was fragile, but Sammy walked it with precision. To his family, he was protector. To the Gambinos, he was enforcer. To himself, he was both. And he believed he could remain both forever. But history doesn't bend to balance. It bends to ambition. And John Gotti's ambition was about to set fire to the Gambino family. The Gambino family was a paradox in the late 1970s. It was the richest of the 5 families, with its fingers in everything from unions to Wall Street scams. But beneath that surface, cracks spread like hairline fractures in marble. Castellano sat in his Staten Island fortress, convinced that money and connections made him untouchable. Down in Little Italy, Delacroce kept the soldiers loyal with his presence, his patience, and his ability to understand the street. Sammy Gravano found himself straddling both worlds. On one hand, Castellano's white-collar schemes gave Sammy's construction businesses room to thrive. He understood how unions could be bent to serve the family. He learned to sit in boardrooms with contractors, appearing legitimate while quietly orchestrating rackets that skimmed millions. Castellano appreciated men like that. On the other hand, Delacroce embodied everything Sammy respected about the Mafia. He was quiet, fierce when necessary, and rooted in loyalty. Sammy gravitated to him not just as an underboss but almost as a role model, the kind of man who balanced power with restraint. This dual alignment was risky, but it gave Sammy perspective. He could see both sides of the family's soul. Castellano's vision of businessmen above the streets, and Delacroce's insistence that true power came from the streets themselves. And all the while, John Gotti was rising like a storm on the horizon. Gotti didn't hide in boardrooms. He made himself a king of the streets. His Ozone Park crew running rackets, hijackings, and gambling with reckless abandon. He dressed like a movie star, spoke loudly in restaurants, and laughed at the idea of keeping a low profile. To many soldiers, especially younger ones, he represented defiance. To Castellano, he was a problem waiting to be solved. The FBI, too, had begun circling. Law enforcement had been battling the Mafia for decades, but in the late 70s, new tools began to change the game. Wiretaps, surveillance, the RICO Act. Suddenly, the walls of secrecy weren't so impenetrable. Bugged phones and bugged social clubs began to catch whispers of conversations that once seemed untouchable. Sammy, careful as ever, adapted. He learned to watch his words, to cloak meaning in casual phrases, to never let his guard down in public. But he also saw how other men, cocky or careless, became ensnared by their own voices on tape. Still, the greatest threat to the Gambinos wasn't the FBI. It was themselves. The split between Castellano and Delacroce deepened as the years wore on. Castellano's disdain for blue-collar gangsters infuriated many in the ranks. He disapproved of drug dealing, yet soldiers whispered that his own nephews were trafficking cocaine. He built a mansion and lived like royalty, while street-level wise guys scraped from numbers and loan sharking. The hypocrisy ate away at morale. Sammy felt the tension everywhere. In the bars, in the construction yards, in the whispers at sit-downs. Respect was fracturing. Then came the blow that would change everything. Aniello Delacroce fell ill. Cancer ate at him slowly, and word spread that the end was near. For the soldiers loyal to him, the ones who saw him as their father figure, the news was devastating. For Castellano, it was an opportunity. Once Delacroce was gone, his faction would weaken, and Castellano's control could tighten. But men like John Gotti weren't about to let that happen quietly. Sammy visited Delacroce in those final days, paying his respects. He remembered the old man's calm, even as death approached. Delacroce never complained, never lashed out. He spoke softly, warning of the dangers of arrogance, of betrayal, of forgetting the code. Sammy listened, knowing he was witnessing the fading of an era. When Delacroce finally died in 1985, it was like a dam breaking. Soldiers mourned him with genuine grief. The old underboss had commanded loyalty in a way Castellano never could. And now, with Delacroce gone, the last restraint on Castellano's arrogance and Gotti's defiance was removed. Castellano didn't even bother attending Delacroce's funeral. To the men who had loved Delacroce, it was the ultimate insult, proof that Castellano saw himself above them all. Sammy watched the reactions carefully. He knew what the others knew. Castellano had made himself a target. His distance, his arrogance, his hypocrisy, all of it had combined into a single fatal flaw, and John Gotti was preparing to exploit it. After Aniello Delacroce's funeral, the air inside the Gambino family felt electric, charged with unspoken fury. Men who had once been patient were no longer willing to wait. Castellano's absence at the funeral wasn't just seen as arrogance. It was betrayal. To many of Delacroce's loyalists, it was a sign that the boss no longer cared for the rank and file, that he had severed himself from the very blood that gave him power. In smoky back rooms and quiet corners of social clubs, whispers grew louder. Paul has to go. John Gotti didn't whisper. He roared. For years, Gotti had been a thorn in Castellano's side, flaunting rules, dressing like a movie star, making himself a public spectacle when Castellano demanded quiet. But now, with Delacroce gone, Gotti positioned himself as the champion of the street guys. He was their voice, their defiance, their hope. He rallied captains who resented Castellano's cold, corporate style. He appealed to soldiers who had been humiliated by their boss's distance. He made himself the leader of a faction that was hungry for change, hungry for blood. Sammy Gravano watched carefully. He wasn't reckless enough to jump too quickly, but he wasn't blind. Castellano's position was crumbling, and Gotti's was rising. For Sammy, the Mafia was about survival and calculation. Loyalty was important, yes, but only when it didn't lead to the grave. And Castellano was steering straight toward the grave. The final straw came when rumors spread that Castellano planned to have Gotti killed. Castellano had grown tired of his disobedience, his defiance, his open flaunting of power. Word was he wanted to replace Gotti's crew, to wipe the problem from the map before it grew any bigger. But if Castellano was planning, so was Gotti. Meetings were held in secret. Trusted men gathered to discuss what once would have been unthinkable: killing the boss of the Gambino family. It was the kind of move that could plunge the entire mafia into chaos, a direct violation of the rule that no boss could be touched without the commission's approval. But to Gotti, waiting for approval meant waiting for his own death. Sammy was drawn into these conversations. At first, he weighed his options. Was it suicide to go against the boss? Would aligning with Gotti mean gambling everything he had built? But then he thought of Castellano's distance, his arrogance, his failure to stand with his men. He thought of Delacroce's funeral, the absence that felt like betrayal. And he made his choice. He would stand with Gotti. The planning began. Surveillance of Castellano's movements, identifying patterns, habits, vulnerabilities. Word was that Castellano often dined at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. That detail became the key. If they could catch him outside the restaurant, in public but controlled, they could strike fast and disappear into the city. Sammy was part of the inner circle now, not just as muscle but as strategist. He knew construction, logistics, planning, and in the Mafia, planning a murder was no different than planning a job. Details mattered. Precision mattered. The difference between success and failure would be measured in seconds. The crew that would carry out the hit was handpicked. Trusted shooters, drivers, lookouts. Every angle of the street was considered, every possible escape mapped. They rehearsed in their minds, over and over, what would happen when the night came. For Sammy, there was no turning back. This wasn't just another contract, another sanctioned hit. This was history. They weren't just killing a man. They were about to decapitate the most powerful mafia family in America. And if they succeeded, the balance of power would shift forever. December 16, 1985. The plan was set. Castellano was expected at Sparks for dinner. The shooters waited in position, engines idling, nerves taut as wire. Snow drifted in the Manhattan air, the city's neon lights glowing against the night. Sammy stood in the shadows of that moment, knowing that within minutes, everything would change. Castellano's reign was about to end, and John Gotti's was about to begin. December 16, 1985. Midtown Manhattan was dressed for Christmas. Storefronts glowed with lights, shoppers hurried through the cold, and snowflakes drifted lazily through the neon haze of East 46th Street. To most New Yorkers, it was just another winter evening. But to the Gambino family, it was the night the earth would shift. Inside black sedans idling near Sparks Steakhouse, men waited with their hearts pounding in their chests. Coats buttoned tight, pistols ready. They rehearsed the moment again and again in their minds. There would be no second chances. One mistake, one hesitation, and they would all be dead men. The target was Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family. For years, he had ruled from his Staten Island mansion, aloof, arrogant, dismissive of the very men who bled for the family. Now, John Gotti had decided his time was over. Sammy Gravano wasn't one of the shooters that night. His role was broader, more strategic. He had been part of the planning, the logistics, the discussions that made this moment possible. Now, standing in the shadows, he was one of the few who fully understood the magnitude of what was about to happen. Just after 5:30 p.m., Castellano's Lincoln pulled up in front of Sparks. He stepped out in his overcoat, his driver close behind. For a split second, the world was still. The snow fell, the traffic lights changed. The city carried on unaware. Then the shooters moved. They came from both sides, guns raised, their movements sharp and practiced. In a burst of thunder, bullets tore through the winter air. Castellano staggered, his body jerking under the impact. He collapsed on the cold pavement, blood spreading into the snow. His driver went down moments later. The shooters vanished into the night as quickly as they appeared, swallowed by the city's chaos. In less than 10 seconds, the most powerful mafia boss in America lay dead on a Manhattan sidewalk. The news spread like wildfire. By the time police arrived, crowds had gathered, gawking at the spectacle of a mafia execution in the heart of New York. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, headlines screamed across the city. Mob boss gunned down outside Midtown Steakhouse. For the mafia, it was an earthquake. Killing a boss without commission approval was unheard of, a direct challenge to the entire structure of Cosa Nostra. But Gotti had done it, and he had done it in broad daylight, in one of the busiest parts of Manhattan. It was a message written in blood. The rules no longer applied. In the days that followed, Castellano's allies scrambled, unsure of how to respond. But many soldiers, especially those who had despised Castellano's arrogance, quietly celebrated. For them, Gotti's defiance was liberation. Within weeks, John Gotti was crowned boss of the Gambino family. The transformation was instant. Where Castellano had hidden in his mansion, Gotti held court in public. He wore $1,000 Brioni suits, strutted through nightclubs, posed for photographs outside courtrooms. The press dubbed him the Dapper Don, and at his right hand stood Sammy Gravano. Sammy had proven himself not only as a killer but as a strategist, a man who could bridge the world of construction rackets and the world of gunfire. Gotti trusted him, valued his judgment, leaned on him as the new order of the Gambinos took shape. To Gravano, the shift felt seismic. He had lived under Castellano's cold rule, seen Delacroix's quiet loyalty, watched the family divide itself in whispers. Now, with Castellano gone and Gotti in command, the air buzzed with energy. The street guys felt emboldened, free, alive. But with boldness came attention. The very flamboyance that made Gotti adored by his men also made him irresistible to the press, and a prime target for law enforcement. Cameras followed him everywhere, splashing his face across newspapers, magazines, and television. The FBI took note. So did prosecutors. For Sammy, the years ahead would be a balancing act. He was closer to power than ever before, Gotti's most trusted lieutenant. But he also understood something Gotti seemed to ignore. The brighter the spotlight, the darker the shadows grew. The Castellano hit had rewritten the rules. It had elevated Sammy to a place few could ever reach. But it had also painted a bullseye on the Gambino family's back. And the FBI was already taking aim. With Castellano gone, the Gambino family became unrecognizable almost overnight. John Gotti didn't rule from a mansion. He ruled from the streets. His headquarters was the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy, a cramped spot on Mulberry Street where men gathered daily, kissing his hand, pledging loyalty, waiting for orders. Unlike Castellano, who preferred secrecy, Gotti embraced visibility. He held court like a king in plain sight of everyone, and the soldiers loved him for it. For years they had chafed under Castellano's disdain, his obsession with white-collar deals and his absence from the neighborhoods. Gotti was the opposite. Approachable, charismatic, a man who lived among them. He wore his wealth like a badge. Brioni suits, manicured hair, expensive jewelry, and made the soldiers feel that his victories were their victories. To the press, he was irresistible. Newspapers splashed his photo on the front page. Television anchors spoke his name with awe and suspicion. Cameras followed him into nightclubs, out of restaurants, into courtrooms. Women swooned, men whispered, children pointed when he passed. He was larger than life, a mafia boss who walked in daylight, untouchable. The tabloids crowned him the Dapper Don. But for the FBI, he was a prize target. Surveillance teams swarmed the rave night, planting microphones in apartments above the club, staking out cars with cameras and long lenses. Every move, every conversation, every handshake was watched, recorded, cataloged. Gotti thrived on attention, but attention was poison in Cosa Nostra. Sammy Gravano understood this better than anyone. Where Gotti basked in the spotlight, Sammy preferred shadows. He didn't crave headlines or tailored suits. He craved control. Under Gotti's reign, Sammy became the architect behind many of the family's rackets. Construction, unions, extortion. He managed them with surgical precision, keeping money flowing upward while making sure the streets stayed quiet. In meetings, Gotti relied on him. Gravano's reputation as both a killer and a businessman made him invaluable. If a problem needed muscle, Sammy knew how to handle it. If a deal needed finesse, he could smooth it over. He was Gotti's anchor, the man who kept the operation steady while the boss reveled in the chaos. But loyalty came at a cost. Sammy began to notice how Gotti's hunger for fame exposed them all. Every time Gotti posed for cameras outside a courtroom, every time his name lit up a headline, law enforcement pressure increased. Wiretaps buzzed with Gambino voices. FBI agents leaned on informants, desperate for cracks in the armor. At first, it didn't matter. Gotti went to trial again and again, assault, racketeering, conspiracy, and each time he walked free. Witnesses disappeared, jurors were compromised, evidence vanished. The press changed his nickname from the Dapper Don to the Teflon Don. Nothing stuck. To the soldiers, it was proof that Gotti was blessed, untouchable, a living legend. To Sammy, it was proof of something else. They were skating on thin ice, and eventually the cracks would show. Still, the money poured in. Gravano's construction rackets expanded across Brooklyn and Staten Island. He controlled unions, dictated contracts, and brokered deals that made millions. To builders, he was both partner and threat. A man who could make jobs run smoothly or shut them down overnight. His nickname, Sammy the Bull, carried more weight than ever. But behind the wealth, behind the laughter in social clubs and the handshakes in restaurants, Sammy saw the danger creeping closer. The FBI wasn't just watching. They were learning. Every conversation at the rave night was another piece of the puzzle. Every court victory for Gotti only hardened prosecutors' resolve. They didn't just want John Gotti. They wanted the Gambino family. They wanted to dismantle the mafia itself. And by standing at Gotti's right hand, Sammy Gravano had placed himself squarely in their sights. On the surface, the Gambino family under John Gotti looked invincible. The boss walked the streets like a celebrity. Soldiers lined up for his blessing, and the tabloids painted him as a modern-day outlaw king. But beneath the shine, tension brewed. Some captains grumbled that Gotti spent too much time in nightclubs, too much money on appearances. Others whispered that he favored flash over discipline, risking everything for attention. For men raised in the old code of silence, Gotti's showmanship felt reckless, even suicidal. Sammy Gravano, ever the pragmatist, felt the strain. He admired Gotti's boldness, yes. He had stood with him at Sparks, had risked his life in the gamble that toppled Castellano. But Gravano wasn't blind. He saw how every camera flash, every headline, every public strut drew the gaze of law enforcement closer. And the FBI was closer than anyone realized. They weren't just circling anymore, they were inside. Microphones planted in apartments near the rave night picked up conversations. Surveillance vans recorded license plates, faces, movements. Informants trickled information, sometimes small, sometimes explosive. Bit by bit, prosecutors built cases that had nothing to do with hearsay and everything to do with recorded voices and paper trails. The first major strike came when Gotti and several key lieutenants were indicted on racketeering charges. The headlines blared. The government called it a death blow to the Gambino family. But Gotti walked free again. Jurors were swayed, witnesses vanished, and the myth of the Teflon Don grew stronger. To the soldiers, it was proof of destiny. To the FBI, it was personal. They doubled down, expanding surveillance, hunting weaknesses. And in that pressure cooker, differences between Gotti and Gravano began to surface. Sammy valued results, money, control, discipline. Gotti valued image, power displayed like a crown, attention as proof of dominance. The two visions weren't yet at war, but the cracks were forming. At home, Sammy's family lived in comfort, yet Louise sometimes asked questions she knew she shouldn't. The children grew up aware that their father wasn't like other fathers. Sammy tried to shield them, but the weight of his double life pressed heavier with each passing year. And all the while, the walls were closing in. FBI agents in unmarked cars took shifts outside the rave night. Microphones captured whispers of murder, extortion, and betrayal. The law wasn't just coming for John Gotti. It was coming for everyone around him. And when it finally struck, Sammy Gravano would find himself at a crossroads he had never imagined. Forced to choose between the code he had lived by and the survival of everything he held dear. By the late 1980s, the Rave Night Social Club was the beating heart of John Gotti's empire. Day after day, soldiers and captains streamed in and out of the cramped Mulberry Street storefront, kissing the boss's cheek, offering tributes. Listening to his booming voice fill the room with confidence. To the public, the Rave Night was legend. To the FBI, it was opportunity. Agents had been circling for years, snapping photos from unmarked cars, recording license plates, charting comings and goings. But observation wasn't enough. The Bureau wanted voices. They wanted proof that could withstand juries, proof that could cut through intimidation, bribery, and silence. So they planted bugs. At first, it was subtle. Microphones hidden near the club picked up fragments. Laughter, shouts, pieces of conversations muffled by traffic and walls. Then they got bolder. They wired nearby apartments, leaned on landlords, slipped into places thought to be safe. Slowly, the rave night became a theater under surveillance. Every meeting a scene the FBI watched unfold. And the voices they caught confirmed what everyone suspected. Loan sharking, extortion, murders discussed like business meetings. The Mafia's supposed code of silence was cracking under the weight of its own arrogance. Sammy Gravano's voice was on those tapes. He never spoke recklessly, never with the flamboyance of Gotti, but his presence was constant. He was there when disputes were settled, when decisions were made, when lives were weighed in silence before orders were given. Gravano wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a consigliere in all but title, the man Gotti leaned on for judgment. And Gotti needed him more than ever. The very flamboyance that made Gotti adored also made him reckless. He spoke too freely, too loudly. He relished being overheard, as though every word was part of his legend. He laughed at the idea of surveillance, mocked the government as if he were invincible. To his men, this bravado was intoxicating. To Sammy, it was terrifying. Gravano had built his life on calculation. Every job, every hit, every move in business was measured. Gotti's recklessness was the opposite. Unpredictable, dangerous. like walking with a man who waved a torch through a field of gasoline. Still, Sammy remained loyal. He enforced Gotti's will, expanded Rackets, and kept the money flowing. His construction empire became one of the Gambino family's most profitable arms. Developers across New York knew the rules. If Gravano was involved, jobs ran smoothly. If not, delays and trouble multiplied. But the darker side of business never disappeared. Murder remained part of the job. Rivals disappeared. Traitors vanished. Debts were collected with bullets. Sammy was no stranger to pulling the trigger when words failed. He didn't brag, didn't boast. He carried out orders with the cold precision of a man who saw violence as just another tool. And each time, his reputation grew. Sammy the Bull was dependable, decisive, deadly. The FBI knew it. Prosecutors knew it. And soon, the entire country would know it. Because as much as the Gambinos thrived, the government was building. Indictments stacked. Surveillance tapes piled up. Cases were assembled piece by piece, each one more dangerous than the last. The press fed on it. Gotti's trials became national theater. Crowds gathered outside courthouses, cheering him like a folk hero. Jurors returned not guilty verdicts again and again. And the nickname stuck harder, the Teflon Don. But Gravano saw what others didn't. He knew acquittals weren't the same as innocence. He knew every trial left the government more determined. And he knew the walls were closing. At home, Louise and the kids lived in comfort. But the unease seeped in. The FBI tail cars parked nearby. The tension in Sammy's shoulders when he came home at night. The whispers on the phone that stopped when the children entered the room. The line between family man and underboss was thinner than ever, stretched to the breaking point. And then came the case that would change everything. A racketeering indictment that targeted not just Gotti, but Sammy himself. The evidence? Hours of wiretaps, voices captured inside the rave night, conversations that stripped away the myth of silence. For the first time, Sammy wasn't just the quiet strategist in the shadows. He was on tape, and he was in the government's crosshairs. The racketeering indictment was a masterpiece of federal persistence. For years, prosecutors had tried to cut into the Gambino family, only to watch cases collapse under bribed jurors, vanished witnesses, or mysterious changes of heart. But this time was different. They had voices. The tapes from the rave night were gold. They captured conversations about extortion, construction kickbacks, loans, even murders discussed in guarded language but clear enough to build a case. For the first time, jurors wouldn't be asked to believe informants with shaky credibility. They would hear the Gambinos in their own words. John Gotti was the headline name, but Sammy Gravano's was right beside his. To the press, the contrast between the two men was striking. Gotti, the flamboyant boss, dripping in silk ties and smirks, a man who seemed to enjoy every flashbulb, and Gravano, quieter, shorter, heavier set, with a stare that seemed colder, harder. Reporters described him as the shadow behind the Don, the enforcer who gave Gotti's power its teeth. In the courtroom, the performance began. Gotti strutted in like it was opening night on Broadway. He smiled for the cameras, winked at supporters, waved like a politician. His lawyers painted him as a victim of government obsession, a businessman harassed for his success. Sammy sat stone-faced. No smiles, no winks, no theater. He studied the jurors, studied the evidence, studied the prosecutors. He didn't believe in invincibility. He believed in survival. And what he saw worried him. The tapes were damning. Not every word was explicit, but the patterns were there. A boss giving orders, lieutenants carrying them out, money flowing upward. And his own voice threaded through it, too careful to be reckless but present enough to tie him directly to the conspiracy. Still, the legend of the Teflon Don carried weight. Jurors hesitated. Fear hung in the air like a fog, fear of retaliation, fear of making the wrong call. Witnesses were shaky, reluctant, and once again, against the odds, Gotti walked. The not guilty verdict sent shockwaves through the underworld. Crowds outside the courthouse erupted in cheers. Gotti grinned like a man who had beaten destiny itself. He was no longer just the dapper Don. Now he was the Teflon Don, a man the government couldn't touch. But inside the Gambino family, not everyone was celebrating. Some captains feared the attention had reached a breaking point. Other bosses on the commission seethed at the arrogance of Gotti's public persona. And Sammy Gravano, though loyal, felt the unease gnaw at him. He knew the FBI wasn't done. Every acquittal only made them hungrier. And with every new tape, every new bug, the noose grew tighter. At home, Louise asked questions she wasn't supposed to. Could they live like this forever? Were the children safe? Sammy gave reassurances, but even he didn't believe them. He felt the weight of the walls closing in, the inevitability of what was coming. And then the government struck again. A new indictment, broader, sharper, built not just on the Rave Night tapes but on informants, surveillance, and years of accumulated evidence. This time, the charges reached into murder, direct accusations that Gotti and Gravano had orchestrated killings. The headlines screamed, "Feds indict Gotti again." But this time, there was a different tone. Prosecutors promised they had airtight evidence. The FBI swore the Teflon Don would finally be nailed to the wall. Sammy's name was right there in the center of it all. Not just as a soldier, not just as an underboss, but as a man accused of pulling triggers, of making bodies disappear, of helping Gotti run the most powerful criminal empire in America. For Gravano, it was the beginning of the end, because this time the government wasn't bluffing. And the next trial wouldn't just test Gotti's legend. It would test the very code of loyalty that Sammy Gravano had lived by his entire life. The new indictment hit harder than any before. This wasn't just about gambling or extortion. It was about murder. The government alleged that John Gotti had ordered multiple killings to secure and maintain his grip on the Gambino family. And alongside him in the indictment stood Salvatore Gravano, Sammy the Bull, accused as his enforcer, his partner, his right hand in blood. The FBI framed it as the culmination of years of work. Prosecutors declared it was time to end the myth of the Teflon Don. No more acquittals, no more theatrics. They promised jurors would hear voices, Gotti's, Gravano's, others, captured on tape, talking about power, loyalty, and death. For Gotti, it was another stage. He strutted into court with his trademark swagger, his Brioni suits gleaming, his chin held high. He cracked jokes with reporters, waved to cheering crowds outside the courthouse, as if the charges were nothing but a nuisance. But for Sammy Gravano, it was different. He had been through indictments before, but this one felt heavier. Murder was different. Murder carried life sentences. Murder meant no coming back. He studied the evidence, listened to the whispers of prosecutors' confidence, and felt the cold weight of inevitability. Inside the Gambino family, paranoia spread. Men wondered who might flip, who might already be talking. Informants had destroyed other families. Now the thought of betrayal hung over every conversation. Gotti dismissed it all with bravado, but Sammy noticed how his boss spoke more often about rats, how suspicion crept into his words like poison. The FBI's surveillance made privacy impossible. Every meeting at the rave night was shadowed by the knowledge that someone, somewhere, might be listening. Some men grew quiet, others defensive. Gravano felt the tension in every handshake, every glance across the table. Yet even under indictment, business continued. Rackets fed money up the chain, construction projects ran under Sammy's firm grip, and the Gambinos maintained their dominance. But the sense of invincibility was cracking. The press still painted Gotti as a larger-than-life figure, but behind the headlines, the law had sharpened its blade. The tapes were damning. The witnesses were ready. And this time, prosecutors swore nothing could save the boss. Sammy walked into court beside Gotti, the flash of cameras blinding, reporters shouting his name now too. For years, he had lived in the shadows, the quiet power behind the throne. But now the entire country knew who he was. Sammy the Bull, underboss of the Gambino family, accused murderer, mob enforcer. And as he took his seat at the defense table, listening to the charges read aloud, Gravano felt the code he had lived by his entire life begin to tremble under the weight of reality. This trial wouldn't just decide John Gotti's fate. It would decide his. The courtroom was electric. Reporters filled the benches, sketch artists sharpened their pencils, and federal agents sat with the quiet satisfaction of men who believed history was on their side. This wasn't just another mob trial. This was the trial, the government's final showdown with the most famous gangster in America, John Gotti. And right beside him sat Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano. For years, Gotti had beaten case after case, strutting out of courtrooms with a smirk that drove prosecutors mad. He was the Teflon Don, the boss who could not be touched. But this time was different. The evidence wasn't whispers, rumors, or frightened witnesses. It was voices captured on tape, undeniable, unshakable. The jury would hear John Gotti and his men in their own words. Day after day, prosecutors played recordings pulled from the rave night. The static-filled hiss of secret microphones filled the courtroom, followed by conversations that left jurors leaning forward in disbelief. There was Gotti, dismissing captains, ordering punishments, bragging about his power. There was Gravano, calm and measured, weighing in on disputes, discussing money, sometimes lives. The very essence of Cosa Nostra. Its secrets, its murders, its extortions, spilled into the open. The spell of invincibility was breaking. For the first time, the jurors weren't staring at Gotti's silk suits or his $1,000 smiles. They were hearing his arrogance, his casual talk of violence, his mockery of the very system now judging him. And for Sammy, something else became clear. Gotti wasn't shielding him. He was sacrificing him. On tape, Gotti pushed blame toward Gravano, painting himself as the boss who didn't get his hands dirty, while implying that Sammy was the one who carried out the blood work. Again and again, Gotti's voice shifted responsibility downward. To Sammy, it was betrayal in slow motion. For years, he had been the loyal soldier, the enforcer, the strategist. He had risked everything to stand beside Gotti, to pull off the Castellano hit, to keep the empire running. And now, in the fight of their lives, the boss was deflecting heat onto him, treating him like a shield against the fire. As the trial dragged on, the contrast between the two men sharpened. Gotti still smiled for cameras, waved to cheering crowds, turned each walk to court into a parade. He believed the myth of the Teflon Don would carry him through again. But Sammy saw the jurors' faces. He saw how they leaned into the tapes, how their expressions hardened. He knew the government had them this time, and he knew that if the boss went down, he would go down with him. At night, in his cell, Sammy wrestled with the unthinkable. Loyalty had been his code, his compass, his identity. But loyalty had always been a two-way street. And now, as he listened to the recordings again and again, he heard not loyalty from Gotti, but betrayal. The government saw it too. They began to circle Sammy quietly, carefully. Prosecutors whispered offers, painted pictures of life sentences, of dying behind bars for a man who would gladly let him take the fall. For the first time in his life, Sammy Gravano, the bull, the killer, the underboss of the Gambino family, considered breaking the code of silence. The trial wasn't over yet, but the choice that would define him for the rest of his life had already begun to take shape in his mind. The tapes kept rolling. Jurors listened to hour after hour of mafia life stripped bare, the rave night conversations where business and murder blended like routine accounting. Each day chipped away at the illusion Gotti had crafted. The silk suits, the tabloid headlines, the swagger. None of it mattered when his own voice betrayed him. Sammy sat at the defense table, expression fixed, his eyes scanning the room. He knew the jurors weren't swayed by theatrics anymore. They weren't dazzled by Gotti's charisma. They were listening, and what they heard was damning. Then came the moment that broke him. One tape in particular cut through the noise. On it, Gotti's voice dripped with contempt as he spoke of Sammy, shifting blame onto him for murders, painting him as the trigger man while distancing himself. To the jury, it was a boss minimizing his own role. To Sammy, it was betrayal carved in stone. He had killed for Gotti. He had risked his life at Sparks. He had managed the Rackets, kept the soldiers in line, made the empire run like a machine. And now, the man he'd followed was ready to throw him to the wolves. When the jury retired, the outcome was all but sealed. On April 2nd, 1992, the verdict thundered through the courtroom. Guilty. John Gotti, boss of the Gambino family, the Teflon Don, was convicted on all counts: racketeering, murder, conspiracy. The myth was shattered. The courtroom erupted. Reporters bolted for phones. Prosecutors grinned in triumph. And agents who had spent years chasing Gotti finally tasted victory. And beside him, Sammy Gravano heard his own fate sealed. Guilty. Life in prison. The same sentence that had just ended Gotti's reign. In that moment, Gravano faced the abyss. Decades of loyalty had brought him here. A life sentence in a concrete cell, dying for a man who had already betrayed him. The Code of Omerta, the Mafia's sacred vow of silence, demanded that he accept it. But another voice whispered louder. Survival. The prosecutors knew it. Almost immediately, quiet approaches were made. Conversations in side rooms, late-night talks with attorneys. They offered Gravano the unthinkable. Testify against Gotti, break the code, and save himself. Sammy wrestled with the decision in silence. To flip was to erase his life's identity, to turn his back on everything he had ever stood for. But to stay loyal was to die in prison for a boss who had already tried to pin everything on him. For a man who had always prided himself on calculation, the math was brutal. In the end, survival won. Sammy Gravano, underboss of the Gambino crime family, killer of men, keeper of secrets, made the choice no one thought possible. He would testify against John Gotti. It was the decision that would not only destroy the most powerful mafia boss in America, it would redefine the mafia itself. When the verdicts came down, the mafia world shook to its core. John Gotti, the untouchable Teflon Don, had finally been nailed. Life without parole. The government called it the biggest mafia conviction in American history. But almost immediately, another story eclipsed it. A betrayal that cut deeper than the conviction itself. Sammy the Bull had flipped. The whispers started in stunned disbelief. Gravano, the underboss, the man who had killed for Gotti, managed the Rackets, enforced the code with cold precision? Couldn't be true, but it was. The most feared enforcer in the Gambino family, the man who had risen from Brooklyn streets to become the second most powerful figure in the nation's most powerful crime family, had turned government witness. In private rooms, the first meetings with prosecutors unfolded. Gravano sat across from men he had spent his life outsmarting. Men who had chased him through wiretaps and surveillance vans. Now he leaned in, speaking calmly, answering questions with precision. He told them about Castellano's murder, the planning, the ambush at Sparks, the decision that reshaped the mafia's landscape. He named names, detailed hits, broke down how money flowed from construction sites to the boss's pocket. He described murders he had personally committed, bodies buried, lives erased. For the government, it was beyond gold. It was a treasure trove. Gravano wasn't just an insider. He was the insider, the man who had sat at Gotti's right hand, privy to decisions and secrets no one else could touch. And when he took the stand, the mafia's darkest nightmares came true. In open court, Sammy Gravano, once the underboss of the Gambino family, pointed his finger at John Gotti. He spoke with the same calm, unflinching tone he had used to settle disputes in the back rooms of social clubs. Except this time, the audience wasn't captains and soldiers. It was jurors, prosecutors, and the watching world. He described Gotti's rise, the murders that paved the way, the meetings at the rave night. He explained the hierarchy, the rules, the code that demanded loyalty, the very code he had now shattered. Gotti's defense tried to paint him as a liar, a killer looking to save himself. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Sammy admitted to 19 murders. 19. Each one laid bare in testimony that sent chills through the courtroom. But to the jury, that wasn't weakness. It was credibility. He wasn't hiding his sins. He was confessing them, owning them, and pointing directly at his boss in the process. The mafia, watching from the shadows, was stunned. Men who had sworn oaths of silence, who had lived by the Code of Omerta, realized the unthinkable had happened. The code was broken by one of their highest-ranking leaders. If the underboss could flip, anyone could. John Gotti sat in court, staring at Sammy with icy contempt. The man he once called brother, now his executioner. His legend evaporated with each word Gravano spoke. The Teflon Don was finished, not by bullets, but by betrayal. For prosecutors, it was a triumph. For the Mafia, it was the beginning of an unraveling. Gravano's testimony didn't just convict Gotti. It sent shockwaves through every family, spreading paranoia, distrust, and fear. If loyalty could no longer be counted on, then nothing was safe. And for Sammy, it was the end of one life and the beginning of another. He had walked away from the code, from the brotherhood, from the very identity that had defined him. He had chosen survival over loyalty, freedom over silence. But freedom came at a price, because in betraying Gotti, Sammy Gravano didn't just end the reign of a mafia boss. He made himself the most wanted man in the underworld, a marked target for life. When the trial ended, the verdict was no surprise. With Gravano's testimony echoing in their ears, the jury found John Gotti guilty on every count. Racketeering, murder, conspiracy. The Teflon Don's armor had cracked wide open. The sentence was swift, life without parole. The courtroom gasped, the media exploded, and across the underworld, a message rang louder than any gunshot. Even the most powerful mafia boss could be brought down, not by rival families, but by one of his own. For the FBI and federal prosecutors, Gravano was a once-in-a-lifetime asset. He wasn't a low-level rat desperate for protection. He was the underboss of the Gambino family, the highest-ranking mobster ever to flip. His testimony didn't just bury Gotti. It exposed an entire world. In exchange, Gravano secured what had once seemed impossible. He avoided a life sentence even after admitting to 19 murders. 19 lives taken, and yet he walked out of prison a free man, protected by the very government he had spent decades outwitting. The Mafia's reaction was volcanic. From Brooklyn to Staten Island, from Mulberry Street to Bensonhurst, the whispers carried venom. Sammy the Bull was a rat, a traitor, a dead man walking. Contracts were whispered on his head, vows of vengeance sworn in smoke-filled rooms. To betray the boss was unforgivable. To betray the Mafia itself was unthinkable. But Gravano wasn't just another defector. He knew their methods. He knew their rules. He knew exactly how they would come for him. And so he disappeared. The Witness Protection Program gave him a new name, a new life. Quiet neighborhoods in Arizona, guarded movements, new identities for Louise and the children. On the surface, it was safety. But underneath, it was exile. Because Sammy Gravano wasn't built for suburbia. He had lived his life in shadows and violence, in power and respect. Now, in his 40s, he was starting over like a ghost, stripped of his past yet still haunted by it. The Mafia, meanwhile, reeled from the blow. Gotti's imprisonment left a vacuum at the top of the Gambino family. Captains jostled for position, paranoia spread, and the fear of betrayal infected every family across the commission. If the underboss of the Gambinos could flip, who else might follow? In many ways, Sammy Gravano's betrayal was more devastating than any single conviction. It cracked the foundation of the Mafia itself, showing that the code of silence, the sacred omerta, could be broken even at the highest level. And though Gravano was gone from New York, his shadow lingered. His testimony was cited in trials against other mobsters. His cooperation became a blueprint for future turncoats. His decision had changed the Mafia forever. But Sammy Gravano wasn't done making headlines. For a man who had lived his life chasing power and control, witness protection was a cage. And soon enough, the Bull would grow restless, making choices that dragged him back into the spotlight and into danger all over again. Witness protection was supposed to be salvation. A new name, new documents, a safe house in the desert far from New York streets. For most informants, it was a chance to vanish, to live quietly, to forget the life they had betrayed. But Sammy Gravano wasn't most informants. For a man who had been an underboss, who had commanded soldiers, who had held power in his hands, the suburbs of Arizona felt like exile. Gone were the nightly meetings, the thick envelopes of cash, the adrenaline of deals and disputes. In their place were cul-de-sacs, shopping malls, and neighbors who smiled too much. Sammy tried to settle in. He had his family. He had freedom, something Gotti would never taste again. but inside he felt the hollowness. The man who had once ruled construction rackets worth millions now found himself mowing lawns, blending in, pretending to be ordinary. And ordinary never fit him. The tension at home grew. Louise, once a loyal partner through the chaos of mob life, struggled to adjust. The children, torn from New York and thrust into anonymity, bristled under the weight of a life they never chose. The Gravanos were safe, but they weren't whole. And Sammy himself couldn't escape the ghosts. Every glance at a stranger in a grocery store felt like it could be a hitman. Every time a car slowed near the house, his instincts screamed danger. He had betrayed the code, and he knew that meant a death sentence if the mafia ever caught him. But fear wasn't the only shadow. Boredom was worse. Sammy had always lived by motion, building, scheming, enforcing. In witness protection, there was nothing to build, nothing to enforce. Just silence. And silence, for a man like Gravano, was unbearable. So the seeds of his return were planted. Small at first, contacts rekindled, whispers of opportunities, ventures that bent the rules. The FBI wanted him to stay quiet, to stay hidden. But Gravano wasn't built for quiet. The irony was brutal. He had risked everything to save himself, to start over. And yet, in the safety of a new life, he found the same restlessness that had driven him into the mafia in the first place. In New York, the mafia was still reeling. John Gotti rotted in prison, his empire fractured. Gravano's betrayal had set a precedent. Other high-ranking mobsters began to flip, trading loyalty for leniency. The code of silence was eroding family by family, case by case. The decline of the American mafia had begun, and Sammy Gravano was one of the men who had lit the match. But as the years ticked on, one truth became clear. The bull wasn't done. And soon, the world would hear his name again. Not in whispers of betrayal, but in headlines, as he stepped back into the light he had supposedly left behind. For most mob turncoats, witness protection was the end of the story. They disappeared into quiet lives under false names, their power traded for anonymity, their survival bought with silence. But Sammy Gravano was not most mobsters. The bull couldn't sit still. In Arizona, his new life had the sheen of safety but the feel of a prison. The wide suburban streets, the neighbors who waved, the routines of middle-class America. None of it fit the man who had once ruled the construction rackets of New York, who had sat at the right hand of the most notorious boss in America. It didn't take long before Gravano grew restless. First came small ventures, businesses that skirted the line of legitimacy. He tried construction again, security companies, even a restaurant. But the taste of easy money, of control, pulled at him like gravity. And slowly, almost inevitably, Gravano drifted back into crime. Arizona wasn't New York, but it had its own underworld, hungry for someone with Gravano's experience. Drugs, particularly ecstasy, were becoming a booming market in the late 1990s. Young people packed clubs, pills flowed like candy, and profits were astronomical. Gravano saw it, understood it, and stepped in. This time, he wasn't just dipping a toe. He was running one of the largest ecstasy operations in Arizona, moving tens of thousands of pills, bringing in millions of dollars. Soldiers weren't captains and wise guys anymore. They were club kids, dealers, small-time hustlers eager to work under the legend of Sammy the Bull. But as always, power came with a price. The FBI, who had once sheltered him under witness protection, began to hear whispers. The DEA picked up trails of pills leading back to him. By 1999, Gravano wasn't just an informant turned exile. He was once again a target. And this time, it wasn't just the government closing in. His family, already fractured by years of hiding, was falling apart under the strain. His son Gerard and daughter Karen, both pulled into his orbit, found themselves entangled in the very business that was dragging him down. For Sammy, family had always been his justification, his anchor. But now, in Arizona, his choices were pulling them into danger too. The sting came swift. Undercover operations, wiretaps, controlled buys. The same tactics Gravano had once outmaneuvered in New York now closed in on him in the desert. The indictment landed like a hammer. Gravano, his children, and nearly 40 others tied to a massive ecstasy ring. The headlines screamed with irony. Sammy the Bull, the government's star witness against John Gotti, arrested for running a drug empire. To the public, it was scandalous. To the mafia, it was almost comical. The man who had destroyed the code of Omerta, the traitor who had toppled Gotti, had undone himself not with bullets but with pills. For Gravano, it was another fall, another cage. But this time, there would be no witness protection, no deals to save him. He had played his final card when he flipped on Gotti. Now, when the government came for him, there was nowhere left to run. The indictment was a spectacle. 40 defendants tied to one of the largest ecstasy rings in Arizona, and at the center stood Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano. Once the government's prized witness, now a fallen star. Prosecutors didn't hold back. They painted Gravano not as a repentant man who had left the mafia behind, but as a career criminal incapable of change. The evidence was overwhelming. Wiretaps, undercover buys, ledgers, and testimony from former associates who had seen the empire up close. Gravano wasn't dabbling. He was running the show. The irony was savage. He had escaped a life sentence for 19 murders by turning on John Gotti, only to risk it all for the glow of power in a desert drug ring. His children weren't spared. Gerard Gravano, his son, was implicated in the operation. His daughter Karen, who had moved west to start over, was caught in the periphery, her name linked in headlines that dragged the entire family into the scandal. For Sammy, who had once justified every choice as being for the sake of his family, it was a bitter twist. In 2001, the gavel came down hard. Gravano was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Gerard received 9. Karen avoided prison time but carried the public humiliation. The Bull, who had once ruled Brooklyn streets, now faced 2 decades in a cell. This time not as a mobster, but as a drug trafficker. The mafia watched with grim satisfaction. To them, it was justice. Sammy the Rat, the man who had betrayed John Gotti, had destroyed himself. He didn't need a contract on his head. His own choices had pulled him down. To the public, the story had a twisted symmetry. Gravano, the killer who walked free by betraying his boss, had been caught again, not by bullets in the street, but by the same law enforcement machine that had once protected him. Behind bars, Gravano's legend shifted. No longer just the underboss who flipped, he became the cautionary tale. A man who could never escape himself, who carried the mafia's darkness wherever he went. His 19 confessed murders loomed larger than ever, his betrayal of Gotti forever stamped on his name, and now the stain of drug trafficking sealed his reputation as a man defined not by loyalty or honor, but by survival and appetite. When the cell door closed on him in Arizona, it wasn't just the end of his freedom. It was the collapse of the second life he had built. Sammy Gravano had tried to outrun his past, but in the end, he carried it with him no matter where he went. And yet, even prison couldn't silence him, because the Bull, restless, unrepentant, and addicted to being heard, would eventually find his way back into the public eye once more. The cell door clanged shut in 2001, and with it, the echo of Sammy Gravano's second life collapsed. Once he had been an underboss, feared and respected on New York streets. Once he had been the government's star witness, toppling the most powerful mafia boss in America. Now he was a prisoner again, a convicted drug trafficker, sentenced to 20 years in federal custody. For most men, it would have been the end. A slow fade into irrelevance, years passing in concrete silence. But Gravano wasn't most men. Prison hardened him in ways even the mafia hadn't. The ecstasy conviction stripped him of credibility with the government, destroyed what little sympathy the public might have held, and gave his enemies in the mafia a grim satisfaction. Yet inside those walls, Sammy Gravano remained who he had always been. Calculating, watchful, unwilling to bend. Inmates whispered his name. Guards eyed him differently. He wasn't just another prisoner. He was Sammy the Bull, the man who had confessed to 19 murders and walked free once, the man who had betrayed John Gotti and lived. Even locked away, his reputation followed him like a shadow. But prison also gave him something unexpected: time. Time to reflect, to rewrite his story, to shape how the world would remember him. Gravano knew he couldn't change what he'd done, the bodies, the betrayal, the drugs, but he could control the narrative. And so he talked. Letters to his family, phone calls from behind bars, conversations with journalists who still chased his name. Gravano's voice kept seeping out. He framed himself not just as a gangster, but as a survivor, a man shaped by circumstance, hardened by betrayal, pushed into choices others couldn't understand. It wasn't confession so much as explanation, a way of carving meaning out of the chaos he had lived. Meanwhile, outside, the world changed. The Mafia was no longer the empire it had been. Wiretaps, RICO cases, and waves of cooperators had gutted the commission. Younger generations barely remembered the names Castellano or Delacroce. But the name Gravano lingered, infamous, a symbol of betrayal and survival. In 2017, after serving nearly 18 years, Sammy Gravano walked out of prison once again a free man. Older now, grayer, but unmistakably still the bull. He had entered in the early 2000s, when flip phones were a novelty. He walked out into a world of smartphones, podcasts, and social media, and almost immediately he saw the opportunity. The man who had once thrived in the shadows now embraced the spotlight. He began granting interviews, releasing his own stories, and eventually building platforms where he could speak directly to an audience hungry for mafia lore. Gravano, the killer, the underboss, the betrayer, had become something new. Sammy the storyteller. It was surreal. A man who had confessed to 19 murders, who had brought down John Gotti, who had trafficked millions in ecstasy, was now telling his story to a digital world that consumed it like entertainment. Some listened in fascination, others in disgust, but everyone listened. Because love him or hate him, Sammy Gravano refused to be forgotten. When Sammy Gravano stepped out of prison in 2017, he was no longer the sharp-featured enforcer of Brooklyn's underworld. Time had weathered him, softened the edges. But the presence, the gravelly voice, the aura of danger, those remained intact. And in a world obsessed with true crime stories, Sammy the Bull still had currency. Almost immediately, his name resurfaced. Documentaries called, podcasts lined up. Authors and filmmakers wanted his version of the story, the inside perspective no one else could offer. Gravano, who once lived by silence, now lived by storytelling. He launched a YouTube channel. He spoke in long, unhurried monologues, recounting murders, betrayals, and the inner workings of the mafia. His voice was calm, almost reflective, as if narrating someone else's life. For younger audiences raised on crime documentaries and Netflix series, it was gripping, the underboss himself pulling back the curtain. Podcasts brought him further into the spotlight. He sat across from hosts who leaned in with fascination, asking about Castellano's murder, the Gotti years, the betrayals, the blood. Gravano answered with a bluntness that unsettled some and enthralled others. He didn't glorify the killings, but he didn't flinch from them either. He described them as choices, as business, as survival. But with the spotlight came controversy. Critics railed against him, furious that a man who had confessed to 19 murders could now profit from his past, turning blood into content. Families of victims felt the pain all over again, watching the man who had destroyed lives build an audience online. Law enforcement officers who had once worked with him felt betrayed all over again, seeing him bask in a strange kind of celebrity. And yet, people kept listening. Gravano had become something rare, a living artifact of a dying world. The mafia of his era, the suits, the social clubs, the rigid codes, was fading into history. But Sammy had lived it, shaped it, and then torn it apart. In his own way, he was both historian and destroyer, the man who could explain the mafia because he had helped bring it down. Even his family remained tangled in the orbit. His daughter Karen reappeared in the public eye through reality television, while Gerard, once pulled into his father's Arizona operation, tried to carve a quieter life. The Gravano name never fully escaped the headlines. For Sammy himself, the reinvention was almost complete. From underboss to witness, from convict to podcaster, he had transformed again and again, surviving every fall. But the paradox lingered. To some, he was a rat, a killer, a man who had betrayed every code he ever swore to. To others, he was a survivor, brutally honest about a world most only imagined, a man who carried the truth of the mafia in his scarred hands. Either way, one thing was undeniable. Decades after he pulled the trigger for Gotti, decades after he broke Omerta, decades after prison walls tried to bury him, people were still listening to Sammy the Bull. And that, perhaps, was his greatest survival of all. The older Gravano sits in front of a camera, the light catching the lines of age across his face. His voice, low and gravelly, carries the weight of decades lived on the edge. On YouTube, on podcasts, in documentaries he speaks, and the world listens. But every word sparks a question that refuses to fade. How should we remember Sammy the Bull? For victims' families, the answer is simple. Gravano is a murderer, a man who confessed to 19 killings. Fathers, brothers, sons who never came home. No video, no podcast, no explanation can bring them back. For them, his platform is an insult, a reopening of wounds that never healed. For law enforcement, there's a bitter irony. The government bent its own rules for Gravano, cutting a deal that let him walk away from 19 murders in exchange for testimony against Gotti. They celebrated him as a witness, then watched him betray that trust by building a drug empire in Arizona. To some agents, his story isn't survival. It's proof that Sammy Gravano never changed, never could change. But for audiences, especially younger generations, the story hits differently. Gravano has become a kind of living museum, a man who can speak firsthand about the rituals, the rules, the betrayals of America's most infamous criminal brotherhood. In a world saturated with dramatizations of mob life, Gravano offers the raw version, the unpolished truth, or at least his truth. And it's that word, truth, that complicates his legacy most of all. Because Gravano doesn't deny what he did. He admits the murders. He details the betrayals. He tells it like it was business, not emotion. That bluntness makes him compelling, but it also makes him chilling. He strips away the romance of mafia movies, showing instead the cold calculus of power, greed, and survival. Yet even as he tells it, he shapes it. Every story is framed, every detail chosen. Gravano the storyteller is also Gravano the survivor, crafting a version of himself that keeps him relevant, that gives meaning to choices most people would call monstrous. He is both narrator and spin doctor of his own history. The ethical debate rages on. Should a man who took so many lives have the chance to profit by talking about them? Should he be given platforms to explain himself, to build an audience, to turn murder into content? Or is his very presence, raw, unfiltered, unapologetic, a public service, a reminder of what organized crime really looks like when stripped of Hollywood glamour? Even within the mafia's fading ranks, his name carries venom. To old-timers, Gravano will always be a rat, the man who broke the code, the underboss who did the unthinkable. In their world, betrayal was worse than murder. And Sammy Gravano betrayed everything. And yet, here he is, alive, talking, telling, still being listened to. That, perhaps, is the final irony. John Gotti, the man who craved fame, rotted in prison until his death. Gravano, the man who betrayed him, lives on in fame of a different kind. Not the adoration of the streets, but the morbid fascination of an audience that can't look away. He survived Gotti. He survived prison. He survived his own betrayal. And in the end, Sammy the Bull survives in the only way he knows how, by refusing to be silent. Sammy Gravano's story has always carried a contradiction at its core. To his enemies, he was a rat. To prosecutors, he was a savior. To himself, he was neither, just a man who chose survival over silence. But what makes a man break the code he once swore on his life to uphold? For Gravano, the answer was layered. On the surface, it was John Gotti, the boss who demanded loyalty but gave none. Gravano had killed for him, protected him, enforced his power. Yet in the end, it became clear that Gotti was willing to let his underboss take the fall. The tapes, the meetings, the posturing, Gotti made it clear that Sammy was expendable. To Gravano, betrayal wasn't breaking the code. Betrayal was realizing that the man he followed had already broken it first. But there was more beneath the surface. Sammy had always been pragmatic, more businessman than dreamer. He wasn't drawn to the mafia for the romance or the rituals. He was drawn to the structure, the control, the chance to climb higher than the streets of Bensonhurst would ever allow. And in his eyes, flipping was just another business decision. The rules had changed and survival meant adapting. It was a mindset that made him dangerous in the mafia and uniquely suited to leaving it behind. Where others clung to the code of Omerta until it crushed them, Sammy treated it like any other tool, useful until it wasn't. This pragmatism shaped his entire life. When Castellano stood in his way, Gravano helped plan the hit. When rivals threatened his rackets, he removed them. When loyalty to Gotti meant his own destruction, he shifted allegiance to the government. Always survival, always calculation, always forward. But survival had a cost. Gravano's choices left him isolated, hated by the men he once called brothers, distrusted by the government that had once celebrated him, and despised by families who could never forgive him. He survived, yes, but he survived alone. And in that isolation, Gravano became a mirror for the mafia itself. The American mafia had thrived on loyalty, silence, and tradition. But as the years went on, greed outpaced honor, ambition outpaced brotherhood, and betrayal became routine. By the 1990s, the mafia wasn't the romantic brotherhood of old. It was a business where survival trumped all. In that sense, Sammy Gravano wasn't the exception. He was the example. He embodied the shift from omerta to cooperation, from family to self-preservation. His betrayal of Gotti symbolized a larger truth. The mafia was eating itself alive, its own rules collapsing under the weight of ambition and distrust. And yet, Gravano never seemed tortured by this. When he spoke of his past, it was without regret. Not cold, exactly, but clear-eyed, as if regret was a luxury he had long since abandoned. He framed his life as choices made in impossible situations, choices that kept him alive when so many others ended up dead or locked away forever. To outsiders, this lack of remorse is chilling. To Gravano, it was survival, and survival was the only code he ever truly kept. When Sammy Gravano took the stand against John Gotti in 1992, it was more than the downfall of one man. It was a tremor that shook the foundation of the American mafia. For decades, the code of omerta had been unbreakable, or so it seemed. Silence was sacred. Loyalty was absolute. Men went to prison and even to their graves rather than speak a word against their family. The mafia survived investigation after investigation because of that silence. But when Gravano flipped, the message was clear. Even the most loyal, even the most powerful could break. And if the underboss of the Gambino family, the second most powerful man in America's most powerful crime family, could turn, then anyone could. The shock spread quickly. In social clubs and backrooms, paranoia grew. Bosses looked at their captains with suspicion. Captains looked at their soldiers with doubt. Trust, once the mafia's most valuable currency, evaporated. Every indictment now carried a new fear. Who would be next to talk? And people did talk. Gravano's cooperation opened the floodgates. High-ranking mobsters in other families began to reconsider their loyalties. Facing life sentences, men who once swore they'd die before betraying the life began cutting deals. The very thing that made the mafia strong, its silence, became its greatest weakness. The numbers tell the story. In the years following Gotti's conviction, dozens of mobsters at every level flipped, testifying in trials that decimated the 5 families. The Commission, once a shadow government ruling New York streets, was crippled by RICO indictments and turncoats. Territories shrank. Revenues dried up. The mafia wasn't dead, but it was dying. Slowly, visibly, inevitably. Gravano's betrayal also changed law enforcement strategy. If they could flip the underboss, why stop there? Investigators began aiming higher, not just at soldiers and captains but at bosses themselves, knowing that fear of betrayal could drive even the most powerful to make mistakes. Surveillance expanded, wiretaps multiplied, and the government learned that patience, combined with pressure, could crack anyone. Inside the mafia, the paranoia was corrosive. Meetings grew smaller. Conversations became guarded. Trust evaporated. Men who had once treated betrayal as unthinkable now weighed it as an option. The code of omerta, once ironclad, had become negotiable. And at the center of this unraveling stood Sammy Gravano. Hated, feared, but impossible to ignore. His decision to flip didn't just destroy John Gotti. It undermined the very mythology of the Mafia, showing that even at the highest levels, loyalty could be bought, broken, or betrayed. The Mafia had survived prohibition, wars between families, even decades of FBI investigations. But in the end, what weakened it most was not the government, not rival gangs, not public pressure. It was itself. Men like Gravano, pragmatic, ruthless, and willing to survive at any cost, tore it apart from within. By the turn of the millennium, the Mafia was a shadow of what it had been in the 1970s and 80s. The social clubs were shuttered, the construction rackets crippled, the commission fractured. What remained was smaller, weaker, no longer the untouchable empire it once was. And though Gravano would later face his own downfall in Arizona, the echo of his betrayal lingered in every indictment, every wiretap, every courtroom where a mobster chose to testify rather than rot in prison. Sammy the Bull hadn't just survived the Mafia. He had helped dismantle it. For all the blood and betrayal of Sammy Gravano's life, perhaps the deepest wounds were not in the streets of Brooklyn but inside his own home. When he turned on John Gotti, Sammy knew he was burning bridges with the Mafia forever. But he also scorched his family's life beyond recognition. His wife, Deborah, had lived through the chaos of mob life. The sudden wealth, the whispers of violence, the long nights waiting for her husband to come home. For years, she turned a blind eye, convincing herself that whatever Sammy was doing, it was for the family. But when Gravano flipped and entered witness protection, her world imploded. The relocation to Arizona was supposed to mean safety, a chance to start over. Instead, it felt like exile. Deborah never adjusted. She despised the desert, the bland houses, the forced anonymity. For her, the glamour of being the underboss's wife had been replaced by the suffocation of living under an alias, in hiding, far from everything she knew. The resentment only grew. For the children, the burden was even heavier. Gerard Gravano, Sammy's son, had grown up idolizing his father. He inherited not only his name but his shadow. In Arizona, when Sammy rebuilt himself through the Ecstasy ring, Gerard was pulled into the operation. To Gerard, it may have felt like loyalty, like carrying on the family trade. But when the indictments came, he went down with his father, sentenced to 9 years in prison. His life derailed before it had truly begun. Karen Gravano, Sammy's daughter, tried to carve her own path, but the Gravano name followed her everywhere. She struggled to reconcile the man who raised her with the man the world saw as a murderer and a rat. In Arizona, she too was caught in the scandal of the Ecstasy ring. Her name splashed across headlines she never asked for. Later, she found her own spotlight in reality television. But even there, the Gravano legacy loomed, shaping her public image as much as her father's choices did. For Sammy, family had always been the justification. He killed to protect them. He flipped to preserve them. He built an empire in Arizona to support them. Yet every decision, every survival tactic, ended up pulling them deeper into his chaos. The irony was cruel. The man who betrayed his mafia family to save his blood family ended up betraying both. Deborah distanced herself, their marriage collapsing under the weight of secrecy and resentment. Gerard lost years of his life in prison, branded by his father's name. Karen shouldered the stigma in public, her identity forever tied to a man who could never escape his past. Sammy often spoke of loyalty, but in the end, loyalty to his family was tangled with the same survival instinct that defined his life. He kept them close, but in doing so, he pulled them into the fire that consumed him. Even decades later, the Gravano family remains fractured, bound together by name, divided by choices none of them could escape. For Sammy, survival meant sacrifice, and more often than not, it was his family who paid the price. From the moment Sammy Gravano broke omerta and took the witness stand, his story became bigger than the man himself. Journalists, authors, filmmakers, they all wanted the inside view. What did it feel like to sit at John Gotti's side? How did the mafia really work? Why did an underboss betray his boss? Gravano, who once lived in shadows, became a character on the world stage. The first wave came with Peter Moss's book, Underboss. a bestseller that told Sammy's story in vivid detail. The book painted him not just as a killer, but as a man of contradictions. Loyal and ruthless, pragmatic and cold, family man and betrayer. Massa's words gave the public their first deep dive into the mind of a mafia turncoat, and Gravano's name became as recognizable as the dons he had once served. Television soon followed. True crime specials replayed his testimony. Documentaries dissected the Gotti trial, often highlighting Gravano as the decisive figure. Each retelling added another layer to his myth, sometimes portraying him as a hero who helped bring down the mafia, sometimes as a villain who killed and betrayed without remorse. Hollywood, too, circled his story. The Gotti trials inspired films and TV movies, with actors portraying Gravano in courtroom dramas and mob scenes. Yet in every portrayal, something was missing: the rawness of the man himself. The Gravano on screen was always an interpretation, filtered through someone else's script. But Gravano wasn't content to be just a character in someone else's story. Years later, when he embraced podcasts, YouTube, and interviews, he took control of the narrative. Now, audiences weren't hearing a dramatized version. They were hearing from Sammy the Bull himself. This shift blurred the line between history and entertainment. Gravano's calm storytelling, his matter-of-fact delivery, pulled listeners into a world that had once been hidden. He described murders with the detachment of someone recounting a business deal. He explained the mafia's rules as if lecturing on corporate policy. It was horrifying and fascinating. For many, this was the closest they would ever come to hearing the mafia's inner workings from the mouth of a man who had lived it. For others, it was offensive, a glorification of crime at the expense of victims. And therein lay the paradox of Sammy Gravano in popular culture. He is both an artifact and an entertainer, both evidence and spectacle. His story educates, but it also captivates. It serves as a warning, but it also feeds the public's endless appetite for mob lore. The mafia has always thrived on myth, the codes, the brotherhood, the glamour of suits and social clubs. Gravano's story dismantled much of that, exposing the greed, the betrayal, the cold violence. Yet at the same time, by telling it over and over, he became part of the myth himself. The underboss who flipped, the rat who lived, the killer who wouldn't be silent. In the end, Sammy Gravano became not just a character in mafia history, but one of its narrators, shaping how the world remembers a criminal empire that once seemed untouchable. America has always had a strange relationship with its criminals. Outlaws, gangsters, kingpins, they inspire fear, but they also inspire fascination. The mafia, in particular, has occupied a unique place in the country's imagination, and Sammy Gravano's story sits right at the center of that paradox. The appeal is layered. On one hand, the mafia represents power, the ability to bend rules, to build empires in the shadows, to live above the law. For many, it feels like a darker version of the American dream. Immigrants carving wealth and influence out of nothing, not through boardrooms or universities, but through loyalty and violence. On the other hand, the mafia is a story of betrayal, greed, and inevitable collapse. And Gravano embodies both sides, the rise and the fall. Hollywood amplified this fascination. Films like The Godfather romanticized the mafia as a family business built on honor and tradition. Goodfellas showed its allure and its chaos. The Sopranos humanized mobsters as men juggling violence with family dinners. Against this backdrop, Sammy Gravano's real-life story felt like the raw truth beneath the fiction. The reminder that for every Corleone fantasy, there was a Gravano reality. Audiences are drawn to men like him not just because of what they did, but because of what they reveal. Gravano pulls back the curtain. He dismantles the mythology, showing that the mafia wasn't about honor or loyalty. It was about power, money, and survival. Yet paradoxically, in exposing the ugliness, he feeds the fascination. There's also the matter of betrayal. Stories of loyalty broken, codes shattered, bonds betrayed. They carry universal weight. Gravano's decision to turn on John Gotti wasn't just mafia history. It was high drama, Shakespearean in scope. The loyal underboss becomes the traitor. The glamorous boss becomes the fallen king. The entire empire unravels because trust collapses at the top. That's not just true crime. That's tragedy. And tragedy is compelling. But fascination comes at a cost. Every time Gravano tells his story, every time audiences tune in, victims' families are forced to hear his voice, to see his name, to remember what was taken from them. For them, the fascination is agony. The man who killed their loved ones has become a kind of dark celebrity, his words consumed like entertainment. This contradiction defines America's relationship with the mafia. We condemn it, but we watch it. We fear it, but we glamorize it. We despise its betrayals, but we can't look away. And Gravano, with his blunt voice and unapologetic honesty, sits at the heart of that tension. He is both villain and guide, both warning and spectacle. Perhaps that is why, decades after his first murder, decades after the Gotti trial, and decades after prison, Sammy Gravano is still being listened to. He is the embodiment of everything that makes the mafia story timeless. Power, loyalty, betrayal, survival, and the inescapable price that follows. When Sammy Gravano walked out of prison in 2017, the world he re-entered was unrecognizable. The streets where he once ruled were quieter. The mafia was weaker, shadows of the empires he had known. And the way stories were told had changed. No more smoky backrooms, no more whispered legends. Now the world lived online, and Gravano adapted. He launched a YouTube channel, just a camera, a chair, and his voice. Gravelly, steady matter of fact. In videos that stretched from minutes to hours, he unraveled the past. Murders, betrayals, the secrets of the Gambinos, the fall of John Gotti. Nothing theatrical, nothing dramatized. Just Sammy the Bull, looking into the lens, telling it straight. The simplicity was part of the draw. Viewers weren't watching an actor or a documentary host. They were hearing it from the man himself, the underboss who lived it, who made the calls, who pulled the trigger. For younger audiences, raised on streaming and podcasts, Gravano was both history lesson and entertainment, a direct link to a vanished underworld. His audience grew. Subscribers piled up. Comments flooded in. Some hailed him as a living legend. Others condemned him as a murderer profiting off pain. The debates spilled into forums, podcasts, and social media. Was Gravano exploiting tragedy? Or was he offering unfiltered truth about organized crime? And the reactions from the underworld were no less divided. Old-school mobsters, what few remained, spat venom at his name. To them, he was still the ultimate rat, a man who destroyed the very foundation of Cosa Nostra. Others, in quieter voices, admitted a kind of grudging respect. Sammy had outlived Gotti. He had outlived prison. And now, somehow, he was thriving in the one arena no one expected, the digital stage. Beyond YouTube, Gravano appeared on major podcasts. Long-form interviews allowed him to reflect on his life, not just as a mobster, but as a man who had survived betrayal, prison, and exile. He spoke of lessons learned, of choices made, of the thin line between loyalty and survival. Some hosts treated him as a guest of honor. Others pressed him harder, demanding accountability. Either way, the episodes drew millions of listeners. The irony was almost surreal. A man who once lived by silence, who once killed to protect secrecy, had become a man defined by his voice. His storytelling was currency now, and it paid well. But it also raised uncomfortable questions. Should a man with 19 confessed murders have the right to profit from telling his story? Should audiences consume his words like entertainment? Or is the very act of listening giving him a kind of immortality he doesn't deserve? For Gravano, those questions never seemed to matter. He told his story because it was his, because survival meant control, and controlling the narrative meant staying alive, not just in body but in memory. And in that way, Sammy Gravano achieved what so many in the mafia never could: longevity. The bosses who once ordered him around were gone, buried in prisons or cemeteries. The code he once broke was shattered beyond repair. But Sammy the Bull was still here, speaking directly into the eyes of a digital audience that couldn't look away. The camera rolls, the microphone hums, and Sammy Gravano begins to talk. Each story draws thousands, sometimes millions, of views. For many, it's compelling history. For others, it's unbearable. Because behind every tale of a hit, behind every betrayal, are real victims. Families left shattered, lives erased. That raises the question. Should a man like Gravano be allowed to profit from telling his story? In the 1970s, outrage over similar cases had led to new laws. After serial killer David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, tried to sell his story rights, New York enacted what became known as the Son of Sam laws. These laws were designed to prevent criminals from making money off books, films, or interviews about their crimes. Any profits would instead be redirected to victims' families. On paper, it seemed clear. Gravano, with his 19 murders, should never see a dime from recounting his past. But the reality was more complicated. Courts struck down many versions of the Son of Sam laws, arguing that they violated the First Amendment's protection of free speech. The idea of silencing someone because of their past, no matter how horrific, created constitutional challenges. As a result, criminals could speak, publish, or film their stories, as long as no direct contract tied the profits specifically to their crimes. And Gravano, ever the survivor, understood how to navigate that line. When Peter Maas's book Underboss was published, legal battles erupted over whether Gravano should receive money. Victims' families fought in court to claim the profits. Deals were restructured, payments redirected, lawsuits filed. In the end, Gravano never saw the kind of fortune some feared, but the controversy left scars that never healed. In the digital era, the lines blurred even more. YouTube monetization, podcast sponsorships, paid appearances, none of these fit neatly into the legal frameworks designed in the 1970s. Gravano wasn't selling a book about his crimes in the traditional sense. He was running a channel, telling stories, building a brand. Legally, the protections for free speech shielded him. Ethically, though, the outrage simmered. Victims' families saw him gaining followers, earning revenue, building a second career out of the very past that had destroyed lives. Advocacy groups questioned how society could allow killers to profit while victims' families struggled to pay bills and live with grief. But there were voices on the other side, too. Some argued that silencing Gravano would only deepen the mythology of the mafia. Better, they said, to let him speak, to strip away the romance and show organized crime for what it really was. His stories, raw and unvarnished, became a kind of cautionary tale, exposing a life most only saw through the lens of Hollywood glamour. And there, in the middle of the debate, sat Sammy Gravano himself. Unapologetic, unmoved. He spoke because it kept him alive, not just physically, but in the only way he truly understood, by remaining relevant. Whether he deserved the platform or not, the fact was undeniable. People kept listening. By the time Sammy Gravano walked out of prison for the last time, the mafia he had once served was a ghost of itself. The five families still existed, yes, but the days of open power, of bosses strutting through neighborhoods with impunity, were over. And in many ways, Gravano's story symbolized why. In the 1970s and 80s, the mafia thrived. Construction unions bent to its will. Nightclubs, restaurants, trucking, garbage hauling, all paid tribute. The commission ruled New York like a shadow government. But the same qualities that made it strong also made it fragile. Secrecy, loyalty, the illusion of honor. Gravano's betrayal cracked that illusion wide open. When the underboss of the Gambinos could sit in court and calmly testify against his own boss, the message to the world was clear. The mafia was not untouchable. Its code was not sacred. Its leaders could be destroyed from within. And the dominoes began to fall. In the years after Gravano flipped, indictments decimated family after family. Bosses who had once seemed immortal were dragged into courtrooms. Wiretaps captured secrets once guarded with blood oaths. Prosecutors built cases not just on surveillance, but on testimony. Men who once swore silence now choosing survival. It wasn't just law enforcement that eroded the mafia's power. The world itself was changing. The unions they once controlled were weakened by oversight. Globalized markets cut into their traditional rackets. Drug money brought fast profits but also chaos, violence, and federal heat. The very empire they had built began to collapse under its own greed. And Sammy Gravano, the man who betrayed Gotti, the man who defied Omerta, became both symbol and catalyst of that collapse. His survival story was inseparable from the Mafia's downfall. But here's the paradox. Even as the Mafia weakened, the mythology grew stronger. Films, books, and shows kept the legend alive, even as the real power diminished. Gravano himself contributed to that myth-making. His voice a reminder that while the Mafia as an institution had faded, its stories still burned bright in the public imagination. For law enforcement, he was proof of concept. If you could flip the underboss, you could flip anyone. For mobsters, he was a nightmare. The rat who lived, the reminder that loyalty no longer guaranteed survival. For the public, he was a character in a larger drama. A man who embodied both the rise and the fall of an empire. By the 2000s, the Mafia no longer ruled New York streets the way it once had. The social clubs were empty. The rackets were gone. The commission, once feared, was broken. What remained was fragments, dangerous still, but nothing like the juggernaut of Gravano's prime. And in the center of it all, still alive, still speaking, was Sammy the Bull. The man who had once risen to underboss, who had overseen murders and fortunes, who had flipped and survived, now stood as a living symbol of the Mafia's twilight. Not its glory, not its honor, but its unraveling. Because in the end, it wasn't law enforcement alone that destroyed the Mafia. It was men like Gravano, men who chose self over code, survival over loyalty. Men who proved that the thing holding the Mafia together wasn't honor at all. It was fear. And once that fear was broken, the empire collapsed. By the time Sammy Gravano re-emerged into the public eye, he was no longer the feared underboss of the Gambinos. His days of running construction rackets, orchestrating hits, and navigating Mafia politics were decades behind him. Now he was an old man in Arizona, gray, gravel-voiced, and battle-worn. But his story was still alive, and he was determined to tell it. In interviews and on his own platform, Gravano often spoke about the past with a mix of detachment and clarity. He didn't glorify the murders, but he didn't apologize for them either. To him, they were part of the life, part of the code he lived under at the time. Business decisions, acts of survival, choices made in a world where mercy was a weakness. When asked if he had regrets, Gravano's answers shifted depending on the moment. Sometimes, he said he regretted the pain his actions brought to his family. His children pulled into the spotlight, his wife embittered, their lives fractured. Other times, he suggested regret was pointless. What was done was done. Regret couldn't bring back the dead or undo the past. Survival had been his only compass, and it had guided him this far. In many ways, Gravano framed his life not as tragedy but as inevitability. He grew up in Bensonhurst, surrounded by the pull of the streets, drawn into the Mafia's gravity from a young age. Once inside, there was no halfway, no escape. Violence was not a choice but a requirement. Loyalty was demanded but rarely given in return. And when the world shifted, when the bosses he trusted betrayed him, he adapted the only way he knew how, by betraying first. Yet beneath the pragmatism, there was a strange undercurrent, almost a desire to be understood, if not forgiven. Gravano told his story over and over, not just to relive it, but to explain it. To show that, in his mind, he hadn't been a monster but a man caught in a system where survival came at the cost of humanity. But how does the world remember him? That depends on who you ask. To prosecutors, Gravano was invaluable. The witness who brought down the Teflon Don, whose testimony opened the floodgates that weakened Cosa Nostra. To law enforcement, he was a symbol of the government's ability to dismantle the Mafia from within. To the Mafia, he was the ultimate traitor. A man who had killed alongside them, only to turn and testify, spitting on the code he had sworn to uphold. His name, even decades later, is cursed in mob circles. To victims' families, he is something worse than both. A killer who continues to speak while their loved ones remain silent in the grave. And to the public, he remains a paradox. A criminal who became a storyteller. A symbol of both loyalty and betrayal. A man who represents the rise and fall of an empire, whose life reads like a script too dark for fiction. As Gravano aged, his reflections never softened into remorse. Instead, they hardened into a kind of philosophy, Life is survival, and survival requires sacrifice. He survived the streets. He survived Gotti. He survived prison. He even survived his own betrayal of the Mafia. And now, in the twilight of his life, he survives in a different way, through memory, through story, through the fascination of those who still want to hear the voice of Sammy the Bull. But survival is not the same as peace. Gravano may have outlived his enemies, but his legacy is not freedom. It is controversy. It is contradiction. It is a story that forces people to ask whether survival at any cost is victory or tragedy. The story of Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano is not just the story of a mobster. It is the story of power gained and lost, of loyalty twisted into betrayal, of survival at all costs. From the streets of Bensonhurst to the dark booths of Rave Night, from the witness stand to the prison yard, from hiding in Arizona to telling his tale on YouTube, Gravano's life has spanned every phase of the Mafia's rise and fall. And in that span, he has left behind a legacy unlike any other. What makes his story endure isn't just the violence, though 19 confessed murders would secure infamy on its own. It isn't just the betrayal, though flipping on John Gotti shocked a criminal world built on silence. It isn't even his survival, though outlasting both allies and enemies speaks to a ruthless adaptability. What makes his story endure is what it reveals. The Mafia once cloaked itself in myth. Honor, loyalty, family, respect. Gravano's life stripped that myth bare. Inside the Gambino family, loyalty was fragile, honor was negotiable, and respect was enforced at gunpoint. What remained was the truth of Cosa Nostra, a world of power and greed, where survival trumped everything else. Sammy Gravano embodied that truth. He rose because he was efficient, ruthless, and loyal when it suited him. He betrayed because the rules that bound him were already broken by others. He survived because he adapted when others clung to fading illusions. And yet, survival came at a cost. His family fractured under the weight of his choices. His wife left bitter, his son imprisoned, his daughter carrying the stigma of his name. Victims' families were left grieving, forced to watch as the man who destroyed their lives became a dark celebrity. Even his Mafia brothers, men who once toasted him in social clubs, cursed his name for eternity. So was he a victor or a cautionary tale? That depends on how one defines victory. Gravano lived when others didn't. He walked free when Gotti died in prison. He tells his story today while most of his contemporaries are gone. But his survival is shadowed by controversy. His legacy etched not in triumph but in contradiction. In the end, Sammy Gravano stands as both a product and a destroyer of the Mafia. He is the underboss who helped bring down a boss, the rat who proved the code of silence could be broken, the killer who became a storyteller, the survivor who can never escape the past that defines him. And maybe that is the ultimate lesson of his life. In a world built on betrayal, there are no heroes, no legends, no victors. There are only survivors. Sammy Gravano survived. But survival is not the same as peace.